My name is Fiona, and at 33 years old, I had spent my entire life playing the role of the dutiful, quiet scapegoat. I work as a forensic accountant, a job that requires me to spot irregularities, trace hidden motives, and remain completely objective under intense pressure. Those skills have served me well in the corporate world, but I never imagined I would need to deploy them on my own wedding day. The reception was being held at the Crestview Country Club, an aggressively opulent venue in the Connecticut suburbs that my parents had chosen mostly to impress their high society friends. The ballroom was a sea of white orchids and dripping crystal chandeliers. I sat at the sweetheart table beside my new husband Leo. At 34, Leo was a brilliant investment analyst with a kind heart and a family that actually understood the meaning of unconditional love. He held my hand under the table, his thumb tracing soothing circles against my palm, completely unaware of the treacherous dynamic playing out right in front of us. The catering staff was circling the room, pouring champagne for the upcoming toasts. I was fixing my posture when my eyes caught the polished reflection of a massive silver serving tray resting on the buffet station just behind our table. In that curved, distorted reflection, I saw my older brother Cameron. At 36, Cameron was the undisputed golden child of our family. He was handsome, loud, and supposedly a wildly successful real estate developer. But looking in that silver tray, I did not see a loving brother preparing to celebrate my marriage. I saw him lean over my designated champagne flute. I watched his hand dip into his tailored tuxedo jacket. I watched him quickly empty a small glass vial of white powder directly into my drink. The powder dissolved instantly into the bubbling liquid, disappearing without a trace. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my face remained perfectly composed. A lifetime of surviving my family had taught me how to mask my emotions. I did not scream. I did not leap up and accuse him. That was exactly what Cameron wanted. He wanted me to look crazy, hysterical, and unstable in front of 200 wealthy guests and my new in-laws. He wanted to ruin my wedding while playing the innocent victim. Instead, my forensic accountant brain took over. I needed to neutralize the threat without causing a scene. Fate handed me an opening. One of the catering servers accidentally dropped a tray of water glasses near the kitchen entrance. The loud crash echoed through the ballroom, and every head in the room turned toward the noise, including Cameron. He stepped away from the table for just 2 seconds to see what had happened. In those 2 seconds, I reached across the pristine white tablecloth. My hand was incredibly steady as I took my tainted glass, slid it to Cameron's spot, and pulled his clean glass over to mine. It was a seamless swap, executed with the precision of someone who had spent her whole life dodging traps. I sat back down, folded my hands in my lap, and breathed evenly. When Cameron turned back around, he adjusted his tie, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He had no idea the game had just fundamentally changed. Cameron tapped his butter knife against his water glass, the sharp ringing cutting through the ambient chatter. The room quieted down. My parents, Thomas and Barbara, sat at the front table gazing up at Cameron with expressions of absolute adoration. They looked at him as if he hung the moon and the stars, completely ignoring the fact that it was my wedding day. Cameron cleared his throat, flashed his expensive veneers at the audience, and began his duties as best man. His speech started with the usual pleasantries, but within seconds the passive-aggressive insults began to surface. He knew exactly how to deliver them, wrapped in a joke, ensuring the guests would laugh while I bled internally. "I am honestly amazed we are all here today," Cameron announced, chuckling into the microphone. "Growing up, Fiona was always so stubborn and difficult. I used to tell my parents she would need to find a saint to put up with her. Luckily, Leo came along and took on the ultimate charity project." Laughter rippled through the ballroom. I felt Leo tense beside me, his grip on my hand tightening with anger. I squeezed back silently, urging him to remain calm. But Cameron was not finished. He turned toward our parents, his voice oozing with false humility and gratitude. "I also want to take a moment to publicly thank our incredible parents, Thomas and Barbara. Let us give them a round of applause. They practically had to drain their entire retirement savings just to afford this beautiful, albeit slightly extravagant venue for Fiona. They have always sacrificed everything for us. The crowd applauded warmly, looking at my parents with deep admiration. Barbara dabbed at her eyes with a lace handkerchief, playing the role of the selfless martyr to absolute perfection. Thomas nodded humbly, placing a comforting hand on his wife's shoulder. I sat there, my smile plastered on my face while pure rage burned in my chest. It was a blatant, calculated lie. Leo and I had paid for every single cent of this wedding. We had written the checks for the venue, the catering, the flowers, and the band. My parents had not contributed a single dollar. In fact, they had complained for months about the location being inconvenient for their friends. But Cameron was using a microphone and an audience of 200 people to rewrite reality, casting my parents as generous victims and me as a selfish, demanding bride. It was the same narrative they had spun for 33 years. I was the difficult burden, and Cameron was the grateful, shining star. Cameron raised his glass high in the air, his eyes locking directly onto mine. The malicious joy radiating from him was palpable. To Fiona and Leo, he said, his voice ringing through the silent room. "Congrats, little sister. My surprise is coming soon. Enjoy the rest of your night." He tipped his head back and drank deeply from the champagne flute. I watched his throat work as he swallowed the poisoned liquid. I raised my own glass, the clean one, and smiled back warmly. "Thank you, Cameron," I mouthed quietly. I took a sip. The trap was set, and the predator had just willingly walked right into it. The band started playing a lively jazz tune as the dinner service concluded. Guests began moving toward the dance floor. Leo leaned over and kissed my cheek. "I am so sorry about his speech," Leo whispered. "You know it was full of lies." "I know," I replied softly. "Do not let it ruin our night. The universe has a way of balancing things out." I kept my eyes on my watch. My mind was calculating the variables. Whatever Cameron had put in that glass, it was meant to incapacitate me quickly enough to ruin the reception. I figured I had about 10 to 20 minutes before the effects took hold. 15 minutes passed. The dance floor was packed. I was swaying gently in Leo's arms, surrounded by our friends and his extended family. Through the crowd, I kept a careful watch on Cameron. He was dancing with one of the bridesmaids, spinning her around with his usual obnoxious flair. But suddenly his rhythm faltered. He stopped moving, his hands dropping to his sides. Even from across the room, I could see a heavy sheen of sweat breaking out across his forehead. His face, normally a healthy tan, drained to a sickly, chalky gray. Cameron grabbed his stomach, doubling over. The bridesmaid backed away, her face twisting in confusion and alarm. Cameron tried to take a step toward the edge of the floor, but his legs simply gave out. He collapsed hard onto the polished white dance floor. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the music screeched to a halt. Cameron began convulsing violently. Before anyone could reach him, a horrific sound echoed through the silent ballroom. He began vomiting violently, dark liquid pooling onto the pristine white flooring. But it did not stop there. The muscle relaxants in whatever cocktail he had consumed took total effect. In front of our parents, his business associates, and high society friends, Cameron entirely lost control of his bowels. The stench hit the air almost instantly. Guests began screaming, covering their mouths, and scrambling backward in absolute horror. The elegant, expensive reception had turned into a nightmare scene in mere seconds. The golden child, the man who cared about his image more than oxygen, was lying in his own filth, shaking and gasping for air. In the chaotic scramble of people backing away, something small and shiny slipped out of Cameron's tailored tuxedo pocket. It hit the floor with a tiny clink and rolled across the slick white tiles. It stopped directly at the tip of my white satin wedding shoe. I looked down. It was a small, unlabeled glass vial, completely empty. The very same vial he had emptied into the champagne glass 15 minutes earlier. I stared at the empty glass tube, and then I looked up at my brother gasping on the ruined dance floor, knowing this was only the beginning of his downfall. The music died instantly, replaced by a chorus of sharp gasps and the frantic shuffling of expensive leather shoes as our 200 high society guests backed away from the center of the room. The stench was immediate and undeniable, completely ruining the delicate fragrance of the white orchids that decorated the tables. My brother lay convulsing in a pool of his own, making his tailored tuxedo ruined his carefully curated image of the untouchable golden child, shattered on the polished white tiles. Total chaos erupted around us. Waiters dropped their serving trays, champagne glasses shattering against the floor. Several of my mother's affluent friends shrieked and covered their faces in absolute horror. But I did not scream. I did not rush to my brother's side to cradle his sweating head. My professional instincts, the very same instincts that allowed me to track millions of dollars in hidden corporate assets, took complete control. I looked down at the small, unlabeled glass vial resting against the satin toe of my wedding shoe. I calmly reached over to the nearest cocktail table, picked up a crisp white linen napkin and bent down. I wrapped the napkin carefully around the glass tube, ensuring I did not smudge any fingerprints Cameron might have left on the surface. As I stood back up, the venue's head of security was already sprinting across the room toward the disaster. I stepped directly into his path and pressed the linen-wrapped vial into his hands. "Keep this secure and hand it directly to the paramedics when they arrive," I instructed, my voice cutting cleanly through the hysterical noise of the ballroom. "Do not let anyone else touch it." My brother ingested whatever was inside this right before he collapsed. The security manager nodded, his eyes wide with shock, and immediately radioed for emergency services. Before I could even turn back to check on Leo, the crowd violently parted. My mother, Barbara, shoved her way through a group of terrified bridesmaids. Her face was flushed a deep mottled red, and her eyes were wild with a frantic, unhinged energy. She did not look down at her son writhing on the floor. She marched straight toward me. Without a single word of warning, Barbara raised her hand and slapped me hard across the face. The sharp crack of her palm striking my cheek echoed over the murmurs of the crowd. My head snapped to the side, a hot, stinging pain blooming across my skin. For a fraction of a second, the entire ballroom went dead silent. Leo was beside me in a flash. He stepped in front of me, using his broad shoulders to physically shield me from my mother. "Do not ever touch my wife again," Leo warned, his voice dangerously low and vibrating with absolute fury. Barbara ignored him entirely. She pointed a shaking, manicured finger over Leo's shoulder, aiming her wrath directly at me. "Look at what you did to him," she screamed, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "You stressed him out. You pushed him over the edge. You forced him to handle all your vendors and coordinate this entire event because you are so incredibly incompetent. You made these bridezilla demands all year, and now he is having a nervous breakdown because of you." It was a breathtaking, spectacular lie. Cameron had not lifted a single finger for this wedding. He had not called a vendor, he had not paid a deposit. He had not even RSVP'd until 3 days before the ceremony. Leo and I had managed and funded every single detail of this night. But this was how my mother operated. Whenever Cameron failed, whenever Cameron made a mistake or caused a disaster, Barbara would instantly rewrite reality to ensure the blame landed squarely on my shoulders. She was putting on a performance for the wealthy guests, desperately trying to spin her son's drug-induced collapse as the tragic result of his devotion to his ungrateful sister. Right behind her came my father, Thomas. He did not rush to his dying son either. Instead, he made a beeline for the country club's general manager, who was staring in dismay at the biohazard currently destroying his $1,000 imported dance floor. Thomas's primary concern, as always, was his public reputation. He operated under the delusion that enough money could erase any embarrassment. Thomas pivoted away from the manager and marched directly up to Leo. "We need to handle this quietly," Thomas demanded aggressively, tapping his finger against Leo's chest. "Write a check for $15,000 right now. Give it to the manager to cover the cleanup and the damages to the venue. We need to protect Cameron's reputation before these people start talking. We have to keep this out of the country club rumors." Leo looked at my father as if the man had lost his mind. "I am not writing a check for your son's public overdose." Thomas Leo fired back, his tone laced with absolute disgust. "Your son just collapsed, foaming at the mouth, and your first thought is to make me pay hush money to the venue. He is not overdosing. Thomas barked, his face twisting in indignance. He is a diabetic. This is a medical emergency. He probably just took too much of his insulin. It is a simple mistake. The audacity of the lie was staggering. Cameron was not a diabetic. He had never been a diabetic. My father was literally inventing a chronic illness on the spot to excuse the fact that his golden boy had just poisoned himself in front of half the town. He did not take insulin, Leo said, refusing to back down an inch. He pointed a firm finger toward the security manager standing near the entrance. He dropped a glass vial of white powder out of his tuxedo pocket when he hit the floor. Security has it. You might want to ask your son what kind of recreational habits he brought to our wedding. Thomas's face went completely ashen, but before he could formulate another absurd lie to protect Cameron, the heavy oak doors of the ballroom burst open. 3 paramedics rushed into the room, pushing a stretcher laden with emergency medical equipment. The crowd scrambled out of their way as they dropped to their knees beside Cameron. The head paramedic immediately began checking his vitals, shining a bright penlight into Cameron's unresponsive eyes. His heart rate is plummeting! The paramedic shouted over the noise of the room, communicating rapidly with his team. We have severe respiratory depression and pinpoint pupils. He is completely unresponsive to verbal stimuli. This looks like a massive overdose of a heavy central nervous system depressant. Did anyone see what he took? We need to know what we are dealing with before his heart stops. The security manager stepped forward immediately, holding out the linen-wrapped vial. He dropped this when he fell, the manager reported faithfully. The bride secured it. The paramedic took the vial, uncapped it, and sniffed the remaining residue. He grimaced, shaking his head. This is not prescription medication. This is a heavy black market cocktail. Looks like high-grade muscle relaxants mixed with illicit sedatives. We need to push Narcan and get him intubated immediately. Load him up now. They hoisted Cameron's limp, soiled body onto the stretcher, strapping him down as they rushed to stabilize his failing heart. The reality of the situation hung heavily over the silent room. Cameron had not suffered a breakdown. He had not taken too much insulin. He had brought a lethal dose of black market drugs to a formal wedding reception. As the paramedics wheeled the stretcher toward the exit, the absolute devastation of the golden child's image became too much for my mother to bear. Her brain simply could not process the fact that her perfect son was entirely at fault. She needed a scapegoat. She needed her lifelong punching bag. Barbara whipped her head around and locked her furious, tear-filled eyes on me. She pointed a shaking finger directly at my face, her voice rising to a hysterical screech that carried out into the hallways of the country club. "You poisoned him!" Barbara screamed, tears of pure venom spilling down her cheeks. "You put something in his drink because you could not stand him outshining you on your wedding day. You have always been jealous of him. You have always hated how much we love him. You tried to kill your own brother tonight just to get the attention back on yourself. I am calling the police, Fiona. I am pressing charges and I am going to see you locked in a cell for this." The ride to the hospital was a blur of flashing streetlights and absolute silence inside the town car that was originally booked to take Leo and me to our honeymoon suite. I sat rigid against the leather seats, the heavy silk and tulle of my wedding dress taking up most of the back row. My mind raced, sorting through the chaotic variables of the night like a complex ledger. Cameron had poisoned himself. He had engineered a horrific public spectacle. The only remaining question was why. My brother was a narcissist, but he was also a calculated predator. He would not destroy his own image without a massive guaranteed payout waiting on the other side. The automatic doors of the hospital emergency room slid open, greeting us with the harsh glare of fluorescent lights and the sterile smell of bleach. I gripped Leo's hand as we navigated the maze of corridors toward the intensive care unit. My white satin heels clicked sharply against the linoleum, announcing my arrival. I refused to look like a victim. I squared my shoulders, lifted my chin, and prepared for war. We found them in the ICU waiting area. The scene was perfectly staged for maximum intimidation. My father Thomas stood in the center of the room with his arms crossed, projecting self-righteous authority. My mother Barbara sat rigidly in a plastic chair, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest. Flanking my father were 2 men I recognized immediately. They were Vince and Marcus Cameron's sleazy real estate partners. They wore cheap cologne and expensive suits that fit them poorly, radiating the kind of arrogant sleaze that usually accompanied offshore wire transfers and shell corporations. Thomas stepped forward the moment he saw me physically blocking the hallway leading to the patient rooms. A local police officer stood near the double doors of the ICU, holding a notepad and looking incredibly sympathetic. "He is awake!" Thomas declared, his voice hard and uncompromising. "And he has already given his statement to the police. Cameron told them exactly how you handed him that drink, Fiona. He told them how you have been making threats all week because you were jealous of his recent business success. He is playing the fragile, traumatized victim to absolute perfection, and the police are eating out of the palm of his hand." I stared at my father, feeling a cold, clinical detachment wash over me. The sheer audacity of the lie was breathtaking, but it was also incredibly sloppy. "You and I both know Cameron poured that vial into my glass," I said, keeping my voice low and perfectly steady. "I simply swapped the drinks. He poisoned himself." Thomas scoffed, dismissing the truth as if it were a minor inconvenience. "It does not matter what actually happened, Fiona. It only matters what people believe. Right now, 200 of the most influential people in the state just watched you send your brother to the hospital on your wedding night. You are a public relations nightmare, and your little stunt has caused a catastrophic chain reaction." Vince, the taller of the two real estate partners, stepped forward with a predatory smirk. "Cameron's investors are pulling out," he announced smoothly. "The footage of him convulsing on the dance floor is already circulating in private group chats. Our backers do not want their money tied to a man whose own sister just tried to murder him. They view it as a massive liability. The firm is bleeding capital by the second, and it is entirely your fault." This was the pivot. This was the moment the trap finally snapped shut. The poisoning, the public collapse, the police statement. All of it was just a theatrical setup for a financial shakedown. My forensic accounting instincts flared to life, connecting the dots with absolute clarity. Thomas reached inside his suit jacket and pulled out a thick manila folder. He opened it and presented a stack of freshly printed legal documents. The paper was crisp, the signature lines already highlighted with bright yellow marker. He shoved a heavy silver pen toward my chest. "This is a crisis mitigation agreement," Thomas stated, his tone devoid of any paternal warmth. "You are going to sign over your 50% equity stake in your forensic accounting firm to Cameron's development company. You are also going to sign a full release transferring your half of grandfather Theodore's trust fund into Cameron's accounts to cover the immediate losses his business is suffering because of your public embarrassment." I looked down at the paperwork. The absolute greed radiating from the pages was staggering. Grandfather Theodore had left a multi-million-dollar trust designed to unlock on my wedding day. Cameron had always been furious that the money was split evenly between us. He believed he deserved the entirety of the estate because he was the firstborn son. Now he was literally using his own stomach pumping as leverage to steal my inheritance. "If you sign these papers right now," Thomas continued, leaning in close to deliver the threat, "we will go over to that police officer and tell him Cameron made a mistake. We will say it was a misunderstanding, a bad reaction to some prescribed medication, and the family is dropping the issue. We will tell the police not to arrest you for attempted murder. You get to walk out of here and enjoy your honeymoon. You just have to pay for the damage you caused." Leo stepped in front of me, his jaw set in a hard, dangerous line. "Are you out of your mind?" Leo demanded, his voice echoing in the quiet waiting room. "You are openly extorting your own daughter. You orchestrated this entire disaster just to steal her trust fund. We are not signing a single piece of paper, and if you threaten my wife again, I will personally throw you through that waiting room window." Thomas sneered at Leo, completely unfazed. "This is family business, boy. Stay out of it." He looked back at me, his eyes cold and dark. "Sign the papers, Fiona. It is the only way you survive tonight." I did not blink. I did not shrink back. I looked at the man who had spent my entire life prioritizing my brother's ego over my safety. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice ringing with absolute certainty. "Cameron engineered this trap, and he can suffer the financial consequences of his own spectacular failure. You can take those papers and shred them." The refusal hung in the air, sharp and decisive. I watched the realization dawn on my father's face that his perfect plan was falling apart. But my mother was not ready to surrender. Barbara knew exactly how to escalate a situation when intimidation failed. She weaponized her emotions. Without warning, Barbara let out a piercing, guttural shriek. She threw her hands in the air and collapsed onto the waiting room floor, dropping to her knees in a display of theatrical agony. My own daughter Barbara wailed, her voice carrying down the hospital corridors, drawing the immediate attention of nurses, doctors, and other waiting families. "She is destroying our family. She tried to murder her own brother out of pure jealousy, and now she will not even help him survive. Help us. Someone help my poor boy. She is a monster." It was a masterful, sickening performance. Barbara clutched at the collar of her expensive dress, rocking back and forth on the linoleum. Bystanders began to whisper, pointing at the cruel bride in the white dress standing over her weeping mother. The police officer near the ICU doors straightened up and began walking toward us, his hand resting cautiously on his utility belt. "Let's go," Leo said firmly, grabbing my hand and pulling me away from the toxic spectacle. "We are done here. Do not engage with them." I turned my back on my parents and the two sleazy business partners. I let Barbara scream her lies to the hospital staff as Leo led me down the corridor toward the main elevators. My heart was pounding, but my mind was remarkably clear. I had successfully navigated the ambush. I had protected my assets. But as we reached the heavy stainless steel doors of the elevator bank, I felt a sharp vibration against my leg. I reached into the hidden pocket of my wedding gown and pulled out my cell phone. The caller ID displayed the name Richard Sterling. Richard was the managing partner at my forensic accounting firm, a strict, uncompromising man who valued corporate reputation above all else. He was not a wedding guest. He had no reason to be calling me at 1 in the morning on my wedding night. A fresh wave of dread washed over me as I answered the call. "Hello, Richard," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Fiona, I need to make this brief and official," Richard said. His tone was icy, devoid of any warmth or congratulatory cheer. 10 minutes ago, the Human Resources Department received a highly detailed anonymous digital tip. The tip contained allegations that you intentionally poisoned a family member at your wedding reception tonight. It included claims of mental instability and unprovoked violence. I closed my eyes, realizing the true depth of Cameron's contingency plans. The extortion was just Plan A. If I refused to sign over the trust fund, he intended to destroy my professional life, so I would have no income to fight him in court. "Richard, it is a complete fabrication," I said urgently. "My brother attempted to drug me, and I simply switched the glasses. It was self-defense. I can explain everything." "It does not matter," Richard interrupted coldly. "As a forensic accountant, your entire career is built on impeccable ethics and unquestionable integrity. You handle millions of dollars in sensitive client data. We cannot have an employee under active police investigation for attempted murder. Effective immediately, you are suspended without pay pending a full criminal investigation. You are locked out of the company servers. Do not contact any clients. We will await the police report." The line went dead. The dial tone buzzed in my ear, a harsh mechanical sound that perfectly matched the cold reality of my situation. I lowered the phone, staring at the polished metal doors of the elevator. Cameron had not just tried to ruin my wedding. He had systematically dismantled my entire life. I was standing in a hospital hallway in a wedding dress, targeted by the police, extorted by my parents, and stripped of my career. But as the elevator doors chimed and slid open, a cold, calculating fury settled deep into my bones. They thought stripping me of my job would make me weak. They forgot that stripping me of my corporate restrictions simply meant I no longer had to play by the rules. I slipped my phone back into the hidden pocket of my gown and turned to face Leo. The sterile hospital corridor felt suffocating, closing in on us with every passing second. We needed to get out of this building before my parents realized I was not going to break and sent the police officer to formally detain me for questioning. Leo did not ask any questions. He took one look at the hardened expression on my face, wrapped a protective arm firmly around my waist, and guided me quickly toward the parking garage. The crisp night air hit my skin the moment the automatic sliding doors parted, a sharp contrast to the suffocating stench of bleach and betrayal inside. We reached Leo's car in the dimly lit concrete structure. I pulled open the heavy passenger door and practically collapsed into the leather seat, the voluminous layers of white tulle and satin spilling over the center console. Leo slid into the driver's seat, letting out a long, ragged exhale as he gripped the steering wheel. The silence in the car was profound, broken only by the distant hum of traffic from the nearby interstate. I reached into the back seat to grab the white bridal coat I had discarded hours earlier. When Leo had rushed to clear a path for us through the chaotic ballroom, he had grabbed my coat from the back of a chair. As I pulled the heavy fabric toward the front seat, a dark mass tumbled out from the folds. It landed squarely on my lap. It was a tailored black tuxedo jacket. The silk lapels were stained with spilled champagne, and the fabric carried the distinct, overpowering scent of Cameron's expensive cologne. The paramedics must have ripped it off him during their frantic assessment on the dance floor and tossed it onto the nearest chair, tangling it directly into my coat. I stared down at the jacket. My forensic accountant instincts, the ones that had just been untethered by my sudden suspension, flared to life. When investigating corporate fraud, the smallest oversight always cracked the case wide open. Criminals always left a trail. I ran my hands methodically along the heavy wool fabric, checking the interior breast pockets. My fingers brushed against a solid rectangular object. It was not the sleek platinum smartphone Cameron constantly flaunted to prove his wealth. It was thick, encased in cheap plastic, and remarkably heavy. I pulled the object out into the dim overhead light of the car. It was a prepaid burner phone. A man like my brother, who cared entirely about status symbols, did not carry a disposable plastic phone. Unless he was conducting business he desperately needed to hide. Leo watched me, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Why does your brother have a burner phone at your wedding?" "Because he is hiding something massive," I said softly, pressing the power button on the side of the device. The screen illuminated the dark interior of the car, casting a pale blue glow across my face. A simple numerical passcode screen appeared. Cameron was a textbook narcissist. He operated under the unwavering delusion that he was the smartest person in any room, and he fundamentally viewed me as intellectually inferior. A man with that level of arrogance never bothered with complex security measures, because he never believed anyone would dare question him. My fingers hovered over the keypad. I typed in the 4 digits of his own birthday. The screen unlocked instantly. "We are in," I whispered, tapping directly into the messaging application. The inbox was completely empty except for a single ongoing thread with an unsaved number. As I opened the conversation, my breath hitched in my throat. I began scrolling through the messages, the cold, hard reality of my brother's actions coming into sharp, devastating focus. This was not a petty sibling rivalry. This was not about him wanting the spotlight on my wedding day. This was a calculated multi-million-dollar conspiracy. "What does it say?" Leo asked, leaning across the center console, his eyes scanning the glowing screen. I read the messages aloud, my voice unnaturally steady as I processed the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. The unsaved number belonged to a loan shark, or at least a highly aggressive private creditor. The messages from the unknown sender were demanding violent and explicit about a massive outstanding debt. They were threatening to seize assets, dismantle Cameron's real estate firm, and go after him physically if the money was not wired by Tuesday morning. Then I read Cameron's desperate, chilling replies. I found the message sent just 4 hours before the ceremony began. "The family trust audit is Monday," Cameron had written. "If she signs the marriage certificate today, her half of the trust unfreezes and I am a dead man. I will dose her at the reception. They will have to commit her to a psych ward and I keep medical power of attorney. Do not touch my firm. The money is coming on Tuesday." The phone slipped slightly in my hands. The silence in the car became deafening. The pieces slammed together in my mind with the absolute precision of a balanced ledger. Grandfather Theodore had left a substantial trust fund divided equally between Cameron and me. My half was heavily restricted, legally bound by a stipulation that required me to be officially married before the funds could be unfrozen and transferred into my exclusive control. The audit was scheduled for Monday to finalize the transfer. Cameron had already drained his half of the trust. He was drowning in illicit debt, and his sleazy business partners were likely covering for him. If my half of the money moved into my accounts, he would have nothing left to steal. He never intended to just embarrass me on the dance floor. The black market sedatives and muscle relaxants were meant to trigger a violent, inexplicable psychotic break in front of 200 witnesses. He wanted the paramedics to haul me away in restraints. He wanted my parents to testify that I had lost my mind. With me involuntarily committed to a psychiatric ward, I would be deemed legally unfit to manage my own finances. Cameron, as my closest male blood relative outside of my new husband, already held a dormant medical power of attorney drafted years ago by our father. He planned to activate it, declare me incapacitated, block Leo from intervening, and drain my entire inheritance to pay off his loan sharks before the Monday audit. My life, my sanity, and my freedom were nothing more than collateral to cover his bad investments. He was going to lock you in a psych ward. Leo breathed, his voice vibrating with a mixture of absolute horror and rising, uncontrollable rage. He was going to drug you, throw you in an institution, and steal your grandfather's money. He was going to take you away from me. Leo slammed his fist against the steering wheel, the sudden violence of the action echoing in the confined space of the car. My parents knew. I realized aloud the sick feeling of total isolation washing over me. They might not have known about the drugs, but Thomas brought those specific equity transfer papers to the hospital. He had them printed and ready. They knew Cameron was in financial ruin, and they were willing to let him extort me to save their precious golden child. I stared down at the burner phone, the blue light reflecting in my eyes. I was no longer a bride. I was no longer a daughter. I was a target who had just survived an attempted financial assassination. They had suspended my job. They had tried to steal my freedom. They had tried to poison my body. They believed they had me trapped in a corner. But they had handed a forensic accountant the exact digital roadmap of their entire criminal enterprise. Before I could strategize our next move, the quiet interior of the car was pierced by a sharp, urgent electronic chime. Leo flinched, reaching into his pocket to retrieve his own phone. A bright red notification banner was flashing across his lock screen. Because we had officially signed our marriage license that afternoon, we had immediately linked our primary banking portals to establish our joint accounts. Any major security alert triggered an automatic notification to both of our devices. Leo stared at the screen, the color draining rapidly from his face. His jaw clenched so tightly I could see a muscle jumping in his cheek. "What is it?" I asked, leaning closer to him. Leo turned the phone toward me. It was an emergency security alert from our primary financial institution. The text on the screen was crisp and absolutely terrifying. An external legal entity had just submitted an emergency petition to freeze all of my personal banking assets, investment portfolios, and the newly integrated joint accounts. The reasoning listed on the petition was citing a sudden medical directive resulting in total mental incapacitation. Cameron was currently lying in an intensive care unit recovering from his own toxic cocktail. But his contingency plan was not pausing for his health. His sleazy real estate partners, the ones standing right upstairs with my parents, were actively executing the backup strategy. They had forged the necessary medical documents, likely utilizing corrupt doctors in their pocket, to officially declare me mentally unfit. They were moving to seize total control of my finances right now in the middle of the night before the banks even opened on Monday morning. The financial trap had just been sprung, and the clock was rapidly counting down to zero. The glowing screen of Leo's phone illuminated the tight, furious lines of his jaw. We did not panic. In my line of work, panic is a useless emotion reserved for people who do not understand the system. Leo immediately dialed the emergency fraud hotline for our bank, utilizing his premium client status to bypass the automated routing software. Within 3 minutes, he had a high-level security manager on the line. Leo aggressively disputed the medical directive as a fraudulent filing blocked all outbound transfers and established a hard verbal passcode for any future transactions. We drove home in a heavy militant silence, the adrenaline of the wedding day entirely replaced by the cold, calculating reality of war. We managed exactly 2 hours of sleep before the true offensive began. It did not start with police sirens or legal summons. It started with a barrage of notifications from social media. By 8 in the morning, Cameron had uploaded a video. He was lying in his hospital bed, looking appropriately pale and devastated. He had clearly manipulated the lighting in the room to emphasize the dark circles under his eyes, and a perfectly positioned intravenous drip provided the ultimate prop for public sympathy. He stared directly into the camera lens, his voice shaking with a masterfully practiced vulnerability. He told his thousands of followers and the entire Connecticut social circuit that he was utterly heartbroken. He claimed that I had suffered a massive, unprovoked mental breakdown at my own wedding reception. He painted a tragic, fabricated picture of a loving brother trying to calm his hysterical, jealous sister, only for her to lash out and poison his drink in a fit of psychotic rage. He actually forced a single tear to fall down his cheek as he begged for privacy and prayers for my supposedly shattered mental health. It was a masterpiece of digital manipulation. It was edited, polished, and engineered to go viral. And it did. Within an hour, it had tens of thousands of views shared by local socialites, his business partners, and worst of all, our own extended family members. My mother had already pinned a long weeping paragraph in the comment section about how the family was desperately seeking the best psychiatric help for me, reinforcing the lie that I was dangerously insane. The fallout was immediate and vicious. My phone began vibrating, continuously buzzing so hard it practically danced across the kitchen granite. I opened my inbox to an absolute avalanche of messages. Aunt Martha called me a toxic monster who belonged in a straitjacket. Cousin Greg told me I deserved to be locked in a padded cell for the rest of my life. There were dozens of messages, some demanding I surrender my trust fund immediately to compensate Cameron for his trauma, others casually suggesting I do the world a favor and end my own life. They had consumed the lie without a single critical question, eager to burn the family scapegoat at the stake. But the social assassination was only the surface level of Cameron's strategy. By 10 in the morning, the professional hits began. My email chimed with an urgent notification from my largest freelance auditing client, a major logistics firm that accounted for 30% of my independent income. The message was brief, citing a sudden restructuring of their financial department as a polite excuse to immediately terminate our contract. 10 minutes later, a second client canceled, then a third. Cameron's real estate partners were actively working the phones, leveraging their country club connections to systematically torch my professional reputation. They wanted to starve me out financially, isolating me so completely that I would be forced to surrender. The pressure compounded when Leo's phone rang. I watched his face tighten as he answered his mother's call. The Sterling family was wealthy, conservative, fiercely protective of their reputation, and entirely unaccustomed to public scandal. I could hear the sharp, clipped tones of my new mother-in-law vibrating through the receiver. She was not screaming, which made it infinitely worse. She was asking pointed, terrifyingly polite questions about the legal parameters of annulments. She wanted to know if Leo was safe, if he needed private security, and if he had made a terrible life-altering mistake by marrying into my family. Leo stood by the kitchen island, his voice calm but absolute. He told his mother that he loved me, that my family was currently running an active extortion racket, and that if she ever suggested an annulment again, she would lose her son permanently. He hung up the phone, set it face down on the marble, and pulled me into his chest, burying his face in my hair. "We are not breaking," he whispered fiercely into the quiet kitchen. "Let them talk. We are going to bury them." I stepped back from his embrace, feeling a cold, crystalline focus sharpening my mind. I was not going to waste a single ounce of energy crying over a family that had actively tried to destroy me. I was not going to film a tearful rebuttal video or engage in a pointless screaming match in the comment section. Arguing with a narcissist in public is exactly what they want. It provides them with the exact supply of attention they crave. I was going to strip Cameron of his power the only way I knew how. I was going to use mathematics. I walked into the spare bedroom, grabbed two massive whiteboards I used for complex audits, and dragged them directly into the center of our living room. I shoved the coffee table out of the way, making room for stacks of printer paper, highlighters, and legal pads. I booted up my personal encrypted laptop. I was officially suspended from my corporate firm, which meant I had absolutely zero competing obligations. I went into full, unrestricted forensic accountant mode. I started with the burner phone we had pulled from Cameron's ruined suit jacket. I connected it to a secure sandbox environment on my computer, bypassing its local interface to rip the raw data directly from the storage drive. I exported the entire message thread with the loan shark pulling the hidden metadata, the precise timestamps, and the specific monetary figures mentioned in their aggressive exchanges. The loan shark was demanding exactly $800,000. That was the target number. I grabbed a red dry erase marker and wrote $800,000 in bold numbers at the top of the first whiteboard. Next, I accessed the online portal for Grandfather Theodore's trust. Because I was a named legal beneficiary, I had read only access to the historical ledgers. I began cross-referencing the dates of the loan shark's text messages with the transactional activity in the trust account. Cameron had been siphoning money for months, disguising the massive withdrawals as legitimate real estate investments, authorized under his capacity as a co-beneficiary. But forensic accounting is simply the art of following the water through the pipes. Water never just disappears, and neither does money. It always leaves a damp trail. I traced the outflow. The trust disbursements were not moving into Cameron's primary business accounts. That would have been too obvious, too easily seized by an aggressive creditor. Instead, the money was being routed through a complex web of intermediary holding accounts, bouncing through regional banks in Delaware and Nevada, before vanishing into a singular obscure limited liability company. I stood in the center of my living room, the floor littered with printouts and banking codes. Leo handed me a cup of black coffee, watching silently as I traced the red lines connecting the digital footprints. Cameron was funneling the stolen trust funds into this specific shell LLC to hide the assets from the loan sharks, while simultaneously preparing to dump my half of the inheritance into the exact same holding company once he successfully declared me incompetent. I sat down cross-legged on the hardwood floor, typing the name of the shell LLC into a federal corporate registry database. I needed to see the foundational documents. I needed to see who was listed as the registered agent and the managing director. If I could link Cameron's signature to this ghost company, I could hand the FBI a perfectly wrapped package of wire fraud and embezzlement. The database took a moment to load, the loading icon spinning mockingly on the screen. The page refreshed, pulling up the digital incorporation papers filed 6 months prior. I scanned the document, my eyes darting past the boilerplate legal jargon, searching for the identifying tax information and the names of the executive officers. My breath stopped in my throat. The coffee cup slipped from my grasp, hitting the floor and shattering, sending hot, dark liquid pooling around my bare feet. Leo dropped to his knees beside me, his hands hovering over mine. "What is it?" he demanded, looking from my pale face to the glowing laptop screen. "What did you find?" I could not speak. I could only point a shaking finger at the screen. Cameron was not the registered agent. My father was not the managing director. The shell company, currently holding hundreds of thousands of dollars in embezzled, untaxed money, was registered entirely under my name. My brother had not just used my name. He had used my exact date of birth. He had forged my digital signature across multiple state lines. And sitting right there in plain black text on a federal tax document was my highly guarded Social Security number. The true scope of the betrayal fractured my entire understanding of reality. Cameron was not merely trying to steal my money or lock me in a psychiatric ward to cover his tracks. He had built a catastrophic financial bomb directly beneath my feet. If his loan sharks triggered an external audit, or if the Internal Revenue Service noticed the massive influx of untaxed capital moving through this shell company, the federal government would not go looking for Cameron. They would look at the registration documents. They would look at the Social Security number on file. They would come directly for me. Cameron had engineered the perfect failsafe. If his extortion plan collapsed, he had set me up to take the absolute fall for his massive financial crimes. I was staring down the barrel of federal tax evasion, identity theft, and wire fraud. If I did not dismantle this shell company and prove the forgery immediately, I was not just going to lose my career and my family. I was going to federal prison. The reality of federal prison hung in the air, cold and suffocating, wrapping around my throat like a vice. I stared at the federal tax document illuminating the dark living room, watching my own social security number blur as my heart pounded against my ribs. Cameron had not merely forged my signature to steal from me, he had weaponized my identity. He had built a financial guillotine, pointed it directly at my head, and wired the trigger to his own catastrophic failures. If his creditors blew the whistle, or if the IRS algorithms flagged the sudden influx of unsourced capital moving through that shell company, the federal agents would not knock on Cameron's door. They would kick down mine. Leo knelt beside me on the hardwood floor, his hand gripping my shoulder. His voice was a low, steady anchor in the spinning room. "We call the authorities right now," Leo said, his eyes scanning the digital incorporation papers. "We hand them the burner phone. We show them the IP addresses. We get ahead of this before the banks open." I shook my head, my eyes never leaving the screen. Calling the authorities now would be a fatal mistake. If we hand this over to the police or the feds right now, they will freeze everything, including the evidence. Cameron has the firm's lawyers on retainer. Thomas has the local police eating out of his hand. They will spin this. They will claim I set up the shell company myself, that I am having a manic episode, and that I stole the burner phone to frame my brother. The forged medical directive they just filed proves they are already building the narrative that I am insane. If I go to the authorities with half a puzzle, I will walk straight into a federal indictment. I pushed myself up from the floor and grabbed a fresh legal pad from the coffee table. The shock was entirely gone, replaced by a terrifying absolute clarity. I could not simply clear my name. I had to mathematically destroy Cameron's trap so completely that no lawyer, no police officer, and no judge could ever question the truth. I needed the raw data. I needed the offshore routing numbers, the hidden ledgers, and the encrypted wire transfers. I sat back down at my computer and cracked my knuckles. I was suspended from my forensic accounting firm, locked out of my corporate email, and stripped of my official credentials. But they had not confiscated my personal laptop, which contained the back-end access keys to the proprietary tracing software I had built myself. Richard thought suspending me would render me powerless. He was incredibly wrong. I plugged Cameron's burner phone directly into my hard drive. Using a secure proxy server to mask my location, I began extracting the digital footprint embedded in the metadata of his text messages. Cameron thought he was a criminal mastermind, but he was nothing more than an arrogant amateur leaving a massive glowing trail of breadcrumbs across the internet. He had accessed his offshore accounts using the burner phone's unsecured browser. I traced the IP addresses straight to a boutique financial institution located in the Cayman Islands. Offshore banks pride themselves on security, relying on heavy firewalls and encrypted portals. But Cameron was lazy. He had reused the same password variations for his offshore accounts that he used for his domestic real estate portals. Within 45 minutes of brute force digital sequencing, I breached the firewall. The screen refreshed, granting me total unrestricted access to the master ledger of Cameron's offshore shell company. I began downloading everything. Decades of bank statements, forged signatures on wire transfer authorizations, and PDF copies of falsified tax returns flooded onto my encrypted hard drive. The sheer volume of the embezzlement was staggering. He had been bleeding grandfather Theodore's trust dry for 3 years, skimming hundreds of thousands of dollars, and funneling the capital through a maze of dummy corporations before landing it in the Cayman account registered under my name. But as I started mapping the outbound cash flow on my whiteboard, a horrifying pattern emerged. The money was not just going to loan sharks or bad real estate investments. There was a consistent recurring series of wire transfers, executing on the first of every single month. I traced the outbound routing numbers, expecting to find another shell company or a hidden offshore vault. Instead, the routing numbers pointed directly to a domestic branch of a premier bank right here in Connecticut. I pulled up the receiving account details, my eyes scanning the beneficiary information. The accounts belonged to Thomas and Barbara. I stopped typing. The silence in the living room was absolute. I stared at the names of my parents glowing on the screen, feeling the remaining shreds of my familial loyalty disintegrate into ash. They were getting stipends. I whispered the words, tasting like poison in my mouth. Leo stepped behind my chair, reading the ledger over my shoulder. "What are you looking at?" he asked, his voice tight with rising anger. I pointed to the massive column of monthly transfers. Cameron was paying them. I said, my voice eerily calm. Every single month he wired $15,000 from the stolen trust funds directly into their personal checking accounts. They were not innocent bystanders. They were not just blinded by their love for the golden child. They were on his payroll. I pulled up the itemized spending reports linked to their accounts. The evidence of their complicity was laid bare in black and white. The stolen money, my money, had funded their entire opulent lifestyle. It paid for Barbara's platinum-tier country club membership. It paid the lease on Thomas's imported sports car. It covered their lavish vacations, their designer wardrobes, and the exorbitant catering bills for their high-society dinner parties. They knew Cameron was stealing from my inheritance. They had to know. The trust was designed to remain locked until my wedding day. Yet they were happily receiving massive monthly payouts from a son who ran a failing real estate firm. They looked the other way because he was funding their elite status. They had sat in that hospital waiting room watching my mother scream that I was a murderous monster, fully aware that they were actively living off the money Cameron was stealing from me. They had demanded I sign away the remainder of my trust to protect their monthly paycheck. The depth of the betrayal was so profound it bordered on suffocating. I had spent my entire life wondering why I was never enough for them, why every achievement I earned was dismissed, why I was always the family scapegoat. The answer was not that I was unlovable. The answer was that I was profitable. My subjugation paid for their luxury. A sudden sharp vibration shattered the heavy silence in the room. Cameron's burner phone, still connected to my laptop, lit up with a bright, glaring notification. The screen displayed a new string of incoming text messages from the unsaved number belonging to the loan shark. I snatched the phone off the desk and opened the message thread. The tone of the creditor had shifted from aggressive to actively threatening. The text was blunt, devoid of any negotiating room. "Your partner Vince just called and said the trust transfer is delayed," the message read. "We do not care about your sister's hospital drama. We do not care about your fake medical emergencies. You lost $800,000 of our money playing the crypto markets, and we are done waiting for your real estate deals to pay out. The deadline is Friday at noon. If the $800,000 is not wired into the primary account by exactly 12 o'clock, we stop calling your burner phone. We start seizing physical assets. We are taking the firm, we are taking your parents' house, and we are coming for you. Do not test us." I stared at the glowing text, a grim smile finally touching my lips. The picture was completely finished. Cameron had not just made a few bad investments. He had gambled nearly $1 million of cartel money on volatile cryptocurrency markets and lost everything. He was a dead man walking, and his panic had driven him to drug me at my own wedding to steal the only remaining capital that could save his life. "He is out of time," Leo said, reading the message over my shoulder. "Friday at noon. That gives us exactly 4 days to dismantle his entire life before his own creditors do it for us." "We do not need 4 days," I replied, turning back to my laptop to organize the downloaded ledgers into a secure encrypted presentation file. "We have the absolute proof of forgery. We have the wire transfer logs proving my parents are accomplices. We have the extortion demands from the loan shark. All we need to do is present this to the right federal authority, and the entire house of cards collapses directly onto their heads." Before I could hit the final encryption key to lock the files, my own personal cell phone began ringing on the coffee table. The caller ID flashed brightly in the dim room. It was the general manager of the elite country club where my wedding reception had been held just hours earlier. I picked up the phone, pressing it to my ear. "Hello," I said, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. "Fiona," the manager said, his voice dropping to an anxious, hurried whisper. I am so sorry to call you this late, especially under these circumstances. But I did not know who else to contact, and my legal department will not be available until Monday morning. What is wrong? I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. Your father just left my office. The manager confessed, the panic evident in his breathing. He drove back to the venue from the hospital about 20 minutes ago. He demanded access to the security control room. When I told him that was against club policy, he pulled out a checkbook. He offered me $20,000 in cash to permanently delete the security footage from the main ballroom and the private bridal suite hallway. He said it was to protect the family's privacy, but he was sweating, Fiona. He was absolutely terrified. My blood ran ice cold, my eyes locking with Leo's across the room. Thomas was not just trying to protect Cameron's reputation, he was actively destroying evidence. Did you take the money? I demanded, my voice cutting through the air like a whip. No, the manager stammered quickly. I refused. I locked the server room and told him he had to leave the property. But Fiona, the security cameras in the bridal suite hallway capture everything. I watched the playback after he left. I saw what your brother did to the drinks before he carried them into the ballroom. You need to get here right now, because your father said he is coming back with a private security team, and he is going to rip the servers out of the wall. Lock the server room door right now, I commanded the venue manager, my voice slicing through the frantic panic radiating from the phone speaker. Do not let my father inside under any circumstances. I am sending a private investigator with an emergency evidence preservation order. If Thomas attempts to force his way into that room, you call the police and you tell them an active burglary is in progress. Do you understand me? The manager swallowed hard, his voice trembling but resolute. I understand, Fiona. The door is deadbolted. I will wait for your guy. I ended the call and looked at Leo. The look passing between us required no translation. We had minutes before Thomas escalated from bribery to physical destruction. Leo immediately picked up his phone and dialed a number from his encrypted contacts. During his years managing high-stakes corporate mergers, Leo had built a network of fixers. He did not call the police, he called Vance. Vance was a former federal agent who now ran the premier corporate espionage and private investigation firm in the state. He specialized in securing volatile assets before they could be legally buried. Leo put the phone on speaker, quickly firing off the address of the country club and the exact location of the security server room. I am 10 minutes out, Vance's gravelly voice replied over the line, the sound of a high-performance engine revving in the background. Have the preservation order drafted and sent to my secure email in exactly 5 minutes. I need the legal authority to back him down the second I walk through those doors. I was already typing. I opened a blank legal template on my laptop and began drafting a formal spoliation of evidence notice. In the forensic accounting world, this document was a nuclear deterrent. It explicitly placed my father and the venue on legal notice that the security footage was paramount to an active criminal investigation. Destroying, tampering with, or deleting that footage after being served this notice would immediately elevate Thomas's actions from a misdemeanor to a federal obstruction of justice charge. I typed my digital signature, attached the relevant state statutes regarding evidence tampering, and encrypted the file before firing it off to Vance's server. The ensuing 20 minutes were an agonizing exercise in silent endurance. Leo paced the length of our living room, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, while I remained seated on the floor amidst the printed ledgers of Cameron's embezzlement. Every second that ticked by was another window for Thomas to smash a server rack or rip a hard drive from its casing. My father was a desperate man, and desperate men with money usually found a way to rewrite history. Finally, my cell phone vibrated. It was Vance. I have the data, Vance announced, the crisp sound of a car door slamming, signaling his departure from the venue. I walked in just as your father was directing 2 private security thugs to breach the server room door. I slapped the preservation order directly against his chest and informed him that the local authorities were currently on standby. The moment he realized he was legally boxed in, he turned completely white. He grabbed his muscle and ran. I pulled the raw, uncompressed files directly from the master server. I am pulling up to your house right now. When Vance walked through our front door 3 minutes later, he did not offer pleasantries. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with an intensely analytical gaze. He handed me a silver heavy-duty flash drive. "It is a 4K high-definition file," Vance stated, walking straight toward my multi-monitor setup in the center of the living room. I bypassed the venue's compression software, so we have the absolute highest resolution available. Whatever happened in that hallway, we are going to see every single pixel. I plugged the drive into my secure port and routed the video file to the largest monitor on my desk. Leo stood on my left, Vance on my right. I navigated to the timestamp perfectly aligning with the 15-minute window before the reception toasts were scheduled to begin. I hit play. The screen flickered to life, displaying a crystal-clear overhead view of the private hallway leading from the bridal suite to the main ballroom. The catering staging area was visible in the bottom right corner of the frame. Two crystal champagne flutes rested on a silver serving tray, waiting to be carried out for the bride and groom. We watched in absolute silence as the digital version of Cameron walked into the frame. His tuxedo was immaculate, his posture radiating that signature arrogant confidence. The high-definition camera captured his movements with terrifying clarity. We watched him pause near the catering tray. We watched his head swivel, checking over his left shoulder, then his right, ensuring the hallway was entirely empty. Then he reached into the interior breast pocket of his jacket. "There it is," Leo breathed, his hands gripping the back of my chair. Cameron pulled out the small, unlabeled glass vial. He popped the cork with his thumb. With practiced deliberate precision, he tilted the vial over the champagne flute positioned on the left side of the tray. The camera caught the faint dusting of white powder cascading into the bubbling liquid, instantly dissolving into the alcohol. He shoved the empty vial back into his pocket and adjusted his cuffs, preparing to play the role of the loving brother. But the footage did not stop there. 10 seconds later, the camera captured me, stepping out of the bridal suite. It showed Cameron turning his back to the tray to greet a passing bridesmaid, flashing her a charismatic smile. And in that brief 5-second window of distraction, the camera captured my survival instinct taking over. It recorded my hand reaching out, grasping the stems of the glasses and executing a flawless, seamless swap. The poisoned flute was moved to the right. The clean flute was moved to the left. I paused the video. The image froze on Cameron happily picking up the poisoned glass, completely unaware that he was holding his own weapon. "It is undeniable," Vance said, his voice laced with professional satisfaction. "This is not circumstantial. This is premeditated attempted assault caught on a multi-thousand-dollar security lens. He brought the drugs. He dosed the drink. You simply handed him his own glass. This exonerates you completely." We hand this to the district attorney, and Cameron is looking at years behind bars. A heavy, profound sense of relief washed over me, loosening the tight coil of anxiety that had been suffocating my chest for hours. We had the embezzlement data. We had the forged medical directives. And now we had the absolute visual proof of Cameron's malicious intent. The war was over. We had won. A sharp, authoritative knock hammered against our front door. The three of us froze. Leo exchanged a dark look with Vance before walking deliberately toward the entryway. He checked the security monitor by the door, his posture rigid. "It is the police," Leo stated, his voice flat. "Two detectives." "Let them in," I said, standing up and smoothing the front of my clothes. I felt a surge of cold confidence. I was no longer the terrified bride backing away from a collapsed body. I was armed with federal-level financial evidence and a pristine security video. Let them ask their questions. Leo opened the door, admitting a tall, stern-looking man and a shorter woman holding a leather-bound notepad. They flashed their badges, stepping into the living room and taking in the chaotic scene of whiteboards, financial printouts, and computer monitors. Fiona Sterling, the male detective, asked, his tone clipped and strictly professional. "I am Detective Rollins. This is Detective Hayes. We are here regarding the incident at the country club earlier tonight involving Cameron Davis." "I am Fiona," I replied smoothly. "And you are here because my family is attempting to frame me for my brother's actions." Detective Rollins did not smile. "Actually, Mrs. Sterling, we are here because your father, Thomas Davis, has formally pressed charges against you on Cameron's behalf." Due to Cameron's current medical incapacitation, your father is acting as his legal proxy. You are officially under investigation for the premeditated poisoning and aggravated assault of your brother. We need you to come down to the precinct to answer some questions. I did not flinch. I simply turned one of my monitors around so it faced the two detectives. I am happy to answer any questions you have, detective, I said, tapping the spacebar on my keyboard. But before we go anywhere, I highly suggest you watch this. The video began to play. I watched the detective's eyes track the high-definition footage. I watched them see Cameron pull out the vial. I watched them see him dump the white powder into the champagne. I watched them see the undeniable reality of his guilt. I waited for the realization to hit them, for the apologies, for the immediate pivot to arresting my brother. The video ended. The screen went black. Detective Rollins sighed a heavy, exhausted sound. He looked at me completely unimpressed by the footage that had just exonerated me. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, official-looking document sealed in a plastic evidence bag. I have already seen a compressed version of this footage, Mrs. Sterling, the detective said quietly. And unfortunately, it does not change our current objective. I stared at him, my confidence fracturing. What are you talking about? He literally poisons the drink on camera. Yes, he does, Detective Hayes interjected, flipping open her notepad. But 2 hours ago, your father marched into our precinct and provided a sworn recorded statement under penalty of perjury. He claimed that you have been suffering from severe paranoid delusions regarding your wedding. He swore that he personally witnessed you purchasing those narcotics from a private dealer 3 days ago. The floor seemed to drop out from underneath me. According to your father's sworn statement, Detective Rollins continued, his voice devoid of emotion. You bragged to your parents about your plan to drug Cameron to ruin his public image. Thomas claims this video simply shows Cameron finding the drugs you left on the counter, realizing what you planned to do, and attempting to dispose of the powder into the nearest liquid to protect you from yourself. Your father signed an affidavit stating you deliberately swapped the glasses to ensure Cameron ingested the poison anyway. It is a lie, Leo snarled, stepping forward aggressively. That is a complete fabricated lie to cover up extortion. It might be, Detective Rollins replied, stepping back and resting his hand on his belt. But right now we have a man in the ICU of video that can be interpreted in multiple ways, and two highly respected parents willing to swear under oath that their daughter is a violent, unstable addict. Right now, Mrs. Sterling, it is entirely your word against your parents, and they are requesting we execute a psychiatric hold. Vance stepped squarely between me and Detective Rollins, his massive frame completely blocking the local detective's line of sight. You will do no such thing, Vance stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute authority. You are holding a sworn statement from a father who just attempted to bribe a venue manager 20 minutes ago to destroy evidence. I am a licensed private investigator and former federal agent. I have a digitally time-stamped preservation order and a 4K security video that clearly depicts an assault. If you attempt to place Mrs. Sterling under a psychiatric hold based on a fabricated affidavit without a judge's signature, I will personally see to it that your badges are melted down and handed to the federal prosecutor before sunrise. Detective Rollins set his jaw, but his eyes darted toward the flash drive resting on my desk. He knew Vance was right. Local police operated on protocol, but they were terrified of federal jurisdiction. You are walking a very thin line, Rollins warned, looking past Vance to meet my eyes. Your father is a highly influential man in this town. He has the ear of the district attorney. We are leaving the premises for now, but this investigation is open and active. Do not leave the state. The moment the front door clicked shut behind the detectives, I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding. Leo wrapped his arms around me, his heart hammering against my back. They are entirely in Thomas's pocket, Leo said, his tone laced with disgust. He bought the local precinct just like he tries to buy everything else. We are not fighting them on local territory, I said, pulling away from Leo and grabbing my encrypted hard drive. Local police care about property disputes and petty assaults. They do not have the jurisdiction or the intellectual capacity to unravel a multi-million-dollar international money laundering operation. We are taking this entirely out of their hands. Within 10 minutes, we were in Vance's reinforced SUV speeding down the empty interstate toward the Regional Federal Bureau of Investigation field office in New Haven. The digital clock on the dashboard read 3 in the morning. I sat in the back seat with my laptop open, running final decryption sequences on the offshore ledgers. I was organizing the data into a lethal, streamlined presentation. I was about to walk into a federal building and confess to being the managing director of a massive shell company used to launder cartel money. If my leverage was anything less than absolute, I would be walking out in handcuffs. The federal building was a towering fortress of concrete and tinted glass. Vance used his former clearance credentials to bypass the standard security protocols, ushering Leo and me directly up to the Financial Crimes Division on the 5th floor. The bullpen was sparsely populated at this hour, but Vance marched us straight into the office of Special Agent Marcus Thorne, the head of the White-Collar Crime Syndicate Task Force. Agent Thorne looked up from a stack of files, his eyes narrowing at the intrusion. Vance did not waste time with introductions. He placed my encrypted hard drive directly onto the center of Thorne's steel desk. "You are going to want to wake up the federal prosecutor," Vance said, pulling up a chair for me. "We just cracked a Cayman Islands money laundering ring operating straight out of a Connecticut real estate firm." Agent Thorne leaned back, crossing his arms. He looked at me, assessing my evening gown and the dark circles under my eyes. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice skeptical. "My name is Fiona Sterling," I replied, my voice steady and cold. "But according to federal tax records filed 6 months ago, I am the managing director of a shell corporation currently holding nearly $1 million of illicit funds. I am also the victim of a premeditated poisoning executed by my brother Cameron Davis, who used my stolen identity to hide his embezzlement. My father, Thomas Davis, is an active accomplice receiving monthly stipends from the stolen funds." Thorne sat upright, the skepticism vanishing instantly. He reached for the hard drive, but I placed my hand firmly over it, pinning it to the desk. "Not yet," I stated. "This drive contains the decrypted offshore ledgers, the IP traces from Cameron's burner phone, the forged incorporation documents, and the wire transfer logs proving exactly where the money went. It is the absolute, undeniable proof of a massive federal crime. But my name is on those corporate documents. Cameron forged my signature and weaponized my social security number to make me the perfect fall guy. Before I give you the decryption key, I require an ironclad, non-negotiable whistleblower immunity agreement. I will not spend a single second in a federal prison for my family's crimes." Thorne stared at me for a long, heavy moment. He picked up his desk phone and pressed a single button. "Get the duty prosecutor in here right now," he ordered. The next 2 hours were a whirlwind of legal negotiations, sworn statements, and bureaucratic red tape. Leo sat beside me, his hand resting reassuringly on my knee while I detailed the entire operation to the federal prosecutor. I explained how Cameron had bled grandfather Theodore's trust dry. I explained the monthly payments to Thomas and Barbara. I handed over the text messages from the loan shark, specifically highlighting the $800,000 demand and the Friday noon deadline. I presented the 4K security footage proving Cameron had drugged me to trigger a false medical directive to steal the rest of my inheritance. I signed my name at the bottom of a sworn affidavit, officially securing my status as a federal whistleblower. The prosecutor signed the immunity agreement, stamping it with the official seal of the Department of Justice. I was legally untouchable. Only then did I type the master password into my laptop, unlocking the drive. Agent Thorne connected the drive to his secure terminal. His eyes widened as the massive spreadsheets flooded his dual monitors. He scrolled through the offshore routing numbers, the shell company aliases, and the cartel payout schedules. He stopped scrolling, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "You have absolutely no idea what you just handed us," Mrs. Sterling Thorne said, looking up from the screens. "We have been running a covert surveillance operation on Cameron's real estate partners for over 8 months. We knew they were moving dirty cartel money through local construction projects, but they were incredibly careful. They washed the cash through offshore accounts faster than we could secure subpoenas. We had the physical suspects, but we lacked the internal ledger to tie the local firm to the Cayman accounts." Thorne tapped his finger against the glowing monitor. You just handed us the Holy Grail. This ledger connects the cartel bosses directly to your brother's firm. It proves the embezzlement, the wire fraud, and the money laundering. It is the exact puzzle piece we needed to secure federal indictments for the entire syndicate. When are you going to arrest him? Leo asked, his voice hard. We do not just arrest your brother, Thorne replied, standing up and grabbing his suit jacket. We take down the entire network simultaneously. The cartel operatives, the corrupt bankers Cameron and your parents. If we move too soon, the cartel will scrub the offshore servers. We need to coordinate a synchronized raid. Thorne pointed to the printed text messages from the loan shark. The deadline is Friday at noon. The cartel is expecting the wire transfer to hit their accounts at exactly that moment. They will all be gathered at the firm's headquarters waiting for the confirmation. We let them gather. We let them think they have won. And at 12 o'clock on Friday, the FBI breaches the doors. I nodded, feeling a cold, crystalline sense of satisfaction. My family had tried to bury me. Instead, they had handed me the shovel I would use to dig their federal graves. I thanked Agent Thorne, shook the prosecutor's hand, and walked out of the office with Leo and Vance. The sun was just beginning to rise as we stepped out of the federal building. The morning air was sharp and clean, washing away the stagnant, terrifying dread of the past 24 hours. I took a deep breath, looking up at the pale blue sky. I was free. I was legally protected. My identity was secure, and the people who had tried to destroy me were about to lose everything they valued. As I walked toward Vance's SUV, my cell phone vibrated in my purse. I pulled it out, squinting against the morning glare. It was a text message from Thomas. I stopped walking, my thumb hovering over the screen. Despite the federal immunity resting safely in my bag, seeing my father's name still sent a reflexive jolt of adrenaline through my veins. I opened the message, reading the words carefully. Cameron is being discharged from the hospital tomorrow, the text read. The doctor said he had a severe allergic reaction, but he will recover. We are hosting a private family dinner at our house on Friday evening. We want you there. We are willing to forgive your hysterical behavior at the reception and put this entire ugly misunderstanding behind us. Bring the equity transfer papers for the trust. If you sign them over to Cameron quietly, we will drop the assault charges. If you refuse, we take your forged medical records and the police report to a judge on Monday morning and have you permanently committed. Your choice. I stared at the screen, a slow, genuine smile spreading across my face. It was the smile of a woman who held a royal flush while her opponents were betting their lives on a pair of twos. Thomas was so arrogant, so blindly confident in his own manufactured reality that he actually believed he was still in control. He thought the local police report and the falsified medical documents were a loaded gun pointed at my head. He had no idea that the federal government was already printing the warrants that would strip him of his wealth, his freedom, and his precious reputation. He was demanding I come to a family dinner on Friday evening. He wanted me to hand over the trust equity just hours after Cameron was supposed to pay off the cartel. He was setting the stage for his final triumphant victory lap. Leo stepped up beside me, reading the text message over my shoulder. He let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. He is threatening to lock you in a psychiatric ward while simultaneously asking you to pass the dinner rolls. The absolute audacity of this man is staggering. What are you going to do? I locked my phone and slipped it back into my purse, stepping into the waiting SUV. I am going to text him back, I said, buckling my seatbelt as Vance started the engine. I am going to tell him I will be absolutely delighted to attend the family dinner on Friday. I will tell him I am bringing the papers. I will give him exactly what he wants. Because by the time Friday evening rolls around, the FBI will have already raided their headquarters. The cartel will be in handcuffs. And I want to be sitting directly across the dining room table from my father when he finally realizes that I am the one who burned his empire to the ground. The flashing lights of the federal vehicles bounced off the pristine white columns of my parents' estate, casting long, erratic shadows across the manicured lawn. Doors flew open before the SUVs had even come to a complete stop. Heavily armed FBI agents swarmed out, their tactical vests emblazoned with bold yellow letters. Following closely behind them were the local police officers, the very same authorities Thomas had believed were safely tucked inside his deep pockets. Agent Thorne emerged from the lead vehicle. He did not rush. He walked with the measured, inevitable pace of a man who held all the cards. He caught my eye as he approached the front steps, giving me a single crisp nod of acknowledgement before turning his attention to the heavy oak doors. Leo and I stood by our car, shielded by the darkness of the driveway, watching the collapse of the Davis Empire unfold in real time. The front doors burst open. Uncle Greg stumbled out onto the porch, his hands raised above his head, his face a mask of utter bewilderment. He was quickly pushed aside by an agent demanding entry. Through the open doorway, the chaotic sounds of the dining room spilled out into the cool night air. The polite, hushed murmurs of the extended family had dissolved into a cacophony of shouting panic and breaking glass. I heard Barbara scream. It was not her usual controlled sound of passive-aggressive distress. It was a raw, visceral shriek of genuine terror. Cameron Davis. Agent Thorne's voice boomed from inside the foyer, loud enough to echo out into the driveway. You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering, and conspiracy. Hands where I can see them. No, wait, this is a mistake! Cameron's voice cracked, high-pitched and desperate. I did not do this. She set me up. Fiona set me up. You need to look at her. We have looked at her. Mr. Davis Thorne replied, the sound of metal handcuffs ratcheting shut, carrying clearly through the air. And we have looked at the offshore ledgers. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you use it. A moment later, 2 federal agents dragged Cameron out the front door. The immaculate suit he had worn to assert his dominance was rumpled, his tie askew. His face was slick with sweat, his eyes wide and panicked as he frantically scanned the driveway. When his gaze finally landed on me standing quietly next to Leo, he stopped fighting the agents. He stared at me, his mouth opening and closing in soundless, suffocating defeat. He looked small. He looked exactly like the terrified, incompetent fraud he had always been. Keep moving, the agent behind him ordered, shoving him toward the back of a waiting cruiser. Right behind Cameron, Thomas was led out in handcuffs by Detective Rollins, the same local detective who had threatened to commit me just hours earlier. Rollins looked grim, his expression tightly controlled as he hauled my father down the porch steps. Thomas was not shouting. He was not threatening to sue the department or calling his lawyers. He looked pale, hollowed out, staring blankly at the flashing lights as the realization of his absolute ruin finally crushed him. Barbara followed, escorted by a female agent. She was weeping hysterically, her perfect makeup ruined, her designer dress stained with spilled wine. She reached out toward Thomas, pleading for him to fix it, to make a phone call, to do something. Thomas did not even look at her. As they loaded my parents and brother into separate vehicles, the extended family began filtering out onto the lawn. Aunts, uncles, and cousins stood huddled together, wrapping their coats tightly around themselves against the chill. They watched the arrest in stunned silence. The people who had judged me, who had pitied me, who had readily consumed the lie that I was an unstable monster, were now standing on the front lawn watching the true criminals being hauled away in federal custody. Aunt Martha caught my eye from across the grass. She looked horrified, her hand resting over her mouth. I did not offer her a reassuring smile or a nod of forgiveness. I simply turned away. I was done seeking their approval. I was done explaining myself to people who required a federal indictment to believe the truth. Agent Thorne walked down the steps, a thick stack of manila folders tucked under his arm. He paused near my car, his expression satisfied. We secured the primary computers from the home office, Thorne said, his voice low. We also found a secondary safe in the master bedroom containing cash bundles and offshore banking tokens that perfectly matched the ledgers you provided. They are done, Mrs. Sterling. The U.S. Attorney is already moving to freeze every domestic asset attached to your father's name to compensate the trust. What about the extortion charges? Leo asked, his arm firmly wrapped around my waist. The medical directive they filed. We found the falsified medical paperwork on the dining room table. Thorne replied, tapping the folders. We are adding extortion and obstruction of justice to the charge sheet. The local district attorney has already moved to formally drop the assault charges against your wife based on the security footage. You are entirely in the clear. Thank you, Agent Thorne, I said, feeling the last remaining knot of tension finally release its grip on my spine. Do not thank me, Thorne replied, shaking his head. You did the heavy lifting. You built the case. We just provided the handcuffs. Have a good night, Mrs. Sterling. We watched the convoy of federal vehicles and police cruisers pull out of the estate, their sirens blaring as they disappeared down the road, carrying the remnants of my toxic family away. The driveway, suddenly empty and quiet, felt entirely different. The oppressive, suffocating weight of the Davis legacy had been permanently lifted. Let us go home, Leo said softly, pressing a kiss to my temple. We drove back to our house in companionable silence. The exhaustion of the past 3 days was finally beginning to catch up with me, a deep, bone-weary fatigue setting into my muscles. But it was a good exhaustion. It was the exhaustion of a battle fought, and definitively won. When we walked through our front door, the living room was still a chaotic mess of whiteboards, highlighters, and financial printouts. I looked at the red lines connecting the shell companies, the offshore accounts, and the monthly stipends. I walked over to the whiteboard and grabbed an eraser, wiping away the $800,000 target number I had written at the very top. I spent the next hour systematically dismantling the war room. I shredded the printed ledgers, packed away the laptops, and scrubbed the whiteboards clean. I did not need the evidence anymore. I did not need the anger or the hyper-vigilant focus. I was reclaiming my living room. I was reclaiming my life. By the time I finished, the sun was fully up, casting a warm, golden light through the living room windows. Leo brought me a mug of hot tea, wrapping a soft blanket around my shoulders as we sat together on the couch. Are you okay? He asked, his voice gentle as he traced the outline of my wedding ring. I looked down at the ring, thinking about the chaos that had erupted just hours after Leo placed it on my finger. I thought about Cameron's malicious smile, Thomas's threats, and Barbara's fake tears. I thought about the sheer terror of facing a federal indictment and the cold, terrifying clarity of dismantling their trap. I took a sip of the tea, letting the warmth spread through my chest. I am better than okay, I replied, resting my head against his shoulder. I am free. Over the next 6 months, the fallout from the FBI raid dominated the local and regional news. The trial was a media spectacle. Cameron, attempting to save himself, tried to accept a plea deal by testifying against his cartel partners. But the federal prosecutors did not need his testimony. The internal ledgers I provided were absolute. Cameron was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison for wire fraud, embezzlement, and money laundering. Thomas and Barbara did not fare much better. The court ruled that their monthly stipends made them active participants in the financial conspiracy. Thomas lost his business licenses and received an 8-year sentence for his role in the cover-up and extortion attempts. Barbara, claiming ignorance to the end, received 5 years for tax evasion and receiving stolen funds. The state seized the sprawling suburban mansion, the imported cars, and the country club memberships to pay back the creditors and restitute grandfather Theodore's trust. The extended family, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, scattered. Aunt Martha and Uncle Greg quietly moved out of state. The cousins stopped calling. I did not miss them. The trust funds, scrubbed clean by federal auditors and fully restored, were officially transferred entirely into my name. I did not invest it in volatile real estate or flashy offshore accounts. I quietly absorbed the capital, using a portion of it to launch my own independent forensic auditing firm. I specialized in tracking hidden assets and exposing corporate fraud. Business was booming. A year after the wedding that nearly ended my life, Leo and I returned to the same country club venue. We did not go to the main ballroom or the bridal suite hallway. We walked out to the expansive gardens overlooking the golf course, holding a small, quiet vow renewal ceremony with just a handful of our closest friends. There was no grand entrance, no extravagant toasts, and absolutely no family drama. As we stood under the floral archway, the afternoon sun warming my face, I looked at the man who had stood by my side while I burned my family's empire to the ground. We exchanged our vows again, this time without the shadow of impending betrayal hanging over us. When the officiant pronounced us married, Leo pulled me in for a kiss, a smile breaking across his face. "No poison this time," he whispered against my lips. "Just champagne," I replied, smiling back. We raised our glasses, the crystal catching the sunlight. We drank deeply, the crisp, clean taste of victory washing away the last lingering ghosts of the past. The nightmare was over, and the future was entirely ours to write. The sun dipped below the Connecticut tree line, casting long, stretching shadows across the sweeping, manicured lawns of my parents' estate. The gravel driveway was already choked with high-end luxury vehicles, a fleet of Mercedes, BMWs, and Range Rovers belonging to our extended family. Leo parked our car near the heavy iron gates. We sat in the idling vehicle for a moment, the steady hum of the engine the only sound in the quiet cabin. I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror. My makeup was flawless, a perfectly constructed mask of calm defiance. My dark dress was elegant and understated. I picked up my black leather clutch from the center console, running my thumb over the discreet clasp. Inside, a high-grade digital audio recorder was already synced and actively running. We walked up the wide stone steps toward the towering oak front doors. I did not bother knocking. I pushed the doors open and stepped directly into the lion's den. The sheer volume of the gathering hit me instantly. The foyer and the sprawling living room were packed with aunts, uncles, and cousins, holding crystal champagne flutes and conversing in hushed, dramatic tones. The moment Leo and I crossed the threshold, the conversations died. The silence was immediate and oppressive. Aunt Martha stood near the fireplace, clutching her pearls and looking at me with a mixture of profound pity and terrified disgust. Cousin Greg took a deliberate step backward, shielding his pregnant wife as if I might suddenly lunge at them. They had all been summoned here to act as an intimidating audience, a wall of social pressure designed to force my total compliance. They had consumed Thomas and Barbara's lies completely. To them, I was the mentally unstable monster who had tried to murder her own flesh and blood. I kept my spine perfectly straight, ignoring the judgmental stares, and walked deliberately toward the formal dining room. Leo stayed right at my side, his presence a solid, unyielding fortress of support. The dining room was a showcase of extravagant wealth. The massive mahogany table was set for 20 guests, adorned with towering floral centerpieces and sterling silver cutlery. At the very head of the table sat Cameron. He did not look like the man who had narrowly survived a poisoning. He did not look like a man whose internal organs had been shutting down just days prior. He looked immaculate. His custom-tailored suit fit perfectly, his hair was flawlessly styled, and his color was excellent. He leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, holding court with a smug, radiant arrogance. When he saw me enter the room, his lips curled into a sharp, malicious smirk. He raised his water glass in a mocking toast. Everyone took their designated seats. I was placed directly across from Thomas, with Barbara seated to his right. The seating arrangement was a tactical execution of power, positioning me as the isolated target, surrounded by hostile forces. The catering staff lingered near the swinging kitchen doors, waiting for the signal to pour the wine and serve the first course. Before a single drop of wine could be poured, Barbara stood up. She picked up a silver spoon and tapped it sharply against the rim of her crystal glass. The bright, ringing sound echoed through the cavernous room, demanding absolute silence. The extended family immediately turned their attention to the matriarch. Barbara adjusted her posture, adopting the sorrowful, burdened expression of a martyr. She looked around the table, making sure everyone was watching her display of maternal grace. "Family is our greatest blessing." Barbara began, her voice quivering with expertly manufactured emotion. "But as we all know, it can also be our heaviest burden. The events of this past week have tested the very fabric of our family. We have faced darkness, betrayal, and a tragedy that almost cost us our beloved Cameron." She paused, letting the heavy silence amplify her words. Aunt Martha let out a loud, sympathetic sniffle. "But we are a family of faith and mercy," Barbara continued, turning her gaze directly onto me. Her eyes were cold, flat, and completely devoid of the warmth her words suggested. "We believe in second chances for troubled women. We know that mental illness is a terrible, destructive disease. Fiona, your psychotic break at your wedding reception was a cry for help. You let your jealousy and your delusions drive you to an unspeakable act of violence against your own brother. A low murmur of agreement rippled through the aunts and uncles. They looked at me with varying degrees of condemnation, fully expecting me to break down, confess my sins, and beg for the mercy Barbara was so generously extending. "We are willing to forgive you, Fiona," Barbara said, placing a hand over her heart. "We are willing to bury the police reports and keep your terrifying actions private. We are willing to get you the intensive psychiatric help you so clearly need, but you must accept the help we are offering. You must surrender to the family's guidance." Barbara sat down to a gentle smattering of applause from the extended relatives. The stage was perfectly set. The audience was primed. It was time for the executioner to step forward. Thomas stood up slowly, smoothing the front of his jacket. He did not bother with the emotional theatrics his wife had employed. He operated entirely on raw, unadulterated power. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit coat and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. The heavy parchment paper landed on the polished mahogany with a solid thud. Thomas placed his hand flat on top of the documents and slid them down the length of the long table. They glided over the polished wood, coming to a stop precisely in front of my empty dinner plate. He reached into his pocket a second time, retrieved a heavy gold-plated fountain pen, and tossed it onto the table. It clattered against the wood, rolling until it rested against the legal files. I looked down at the papers. The bold black text at the top of the first page was unmistakable. It was an irrevocable equity transfer agreement. It explicitly signed over my entire 50% stake in grandfather Theodore's trust, granting Cameron total unrestricted access to the capital. "Sign it, Fiona," Thomas demanded, his voice ringing out with absolute dictatorial authority. "Apologize to your brother, hand over control of the trust right now, and we can remain a family. We will tear up the police report. We will tear up the psychiatric hold documentation. You will walk out of here a free woman." The entire dining room held its breath. Thomas stood tall, his jaw set in a hard line. "If you refuse," Thomas continued, pointing a finger directly at my face, "I will have the authorities waiting at the end of the driveway before dessert is served. If you do not sign over the trust, we have 2 doctors ready to sign off on your involuntary commitment. You will lose your job, your husband, and your freedom." Leo instantly stood up, his chair scraping violently across the hardwood floor. His hands curled into tight fists, his entire body radiating an explosive, protective rage. He was ready to physically drag Thomas across the table. I reached up and placed a calm, steady hand on Leo's arm. I gave him a single, subtle nod. He took a sharp breath, his jaw locked in fury, but he slowly lowered himself back into his chair. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not yell. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting neatly in my lap. I slowly shifted my gaze from the documents to Cameron, who was watching me from the head of the table like a predator observing a trapped animal. My silence hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The extended family interpreted my lack of response as total submission. They thought I was paralyzed by fear. They thought I had finally been broken by the overwhelming weight of their collective judgment. Cameron let out a low, patronizing chuckle. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, feeling the absolute rush of absolute victory. He believed he had won. He believed his extortion plot was flawless. "It is just business, sis," Cameron said, his voice dripping with malicious condescension. He looked at the aunts and uncles, playing to his audience. "You clearly aren't stable enough to manage your own assets. Look at you. You are sitting there completely catatonic. Let the men handle it. It is better for everyone this way." He leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, crossing his arms over his chest. He was so drunk on his own perceived power that he could not resist twisting the knife. He needed to prove his dominance. He needed to brag. "Honestly, I am doing you a favor," Cameron continued, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "You would have blown that trust money on something stupid anyway. I know how to leverage capital. I have been putting grandfather's money to good use for the last 3 years." Thomas shot Cameron a sharp warning look, a silent command to shut his mouth. But Cameron was too arrogant to listen. He believed he was utterly untouchable in this room. He believed the family loyalty would protect his secrets just as it had protected his violence. It is called aggressive financial restructuring, Fiona Cameron bragged, grinning at me. You sit there acting so high and mighty, but you had no idea I was draining those accounts right out from under you. The trust was sitting there gathering dust. I moved the funds to cover my commercial developments. I took the capital because I needed it and because I knew I could take it without you ever noticing. You were always too stupid to see the big picture. The dining room was dead silent. The extended family shifted uncomfortably in their seats, the word draining hanging in the air. This was not part of the narrative Barbara had just spun. This was not about mercy or mental illness. This was a direct confession of theft. But no one spoke. No one dared to interrupt the golden child. Cameron smiled, satisfied with his monologue. Now pick up the pen, be a good little sister, and sign the damn papers. I looked down at the table. My black leather purse was sitting just inches from my water glass. The green indicator light on my phone screen, hidden beneath the leather flap, confirmed that the digital recording app was capturing every single word in high-definition audio. I slowly reached out and picked up the gold-plated fountain pen Thomas had thrown at me. I held it between my hands, feeling the cold, heavy metal against my skin. I did not look at the documents. I did not uncap the pen. I tightened my grip, twisting my wrists in opposite directions, and snapped the expensive fountain pen perfectly in half. The sharp crack of the breaking metal echoed like a gunshot through the silent dining room. Ink splattered across the pristine equity transfer documents, ruining the signature lines in a mess of dark blue stains. Barbara gasped, clutching her napkin. Thomas slammed his hands flat on the table, his face flushing purple with explosive rage. "What the hell are you doing?" Thomas roared, leaning over the table. I dropped the broken pieces of the pen onto the ruined documents. I reached into my coat pocket, bypassing my purse entirely, and pulled out a small black remote control. I held it up, letting the entire room see it. I brought a presentation for the adults. Friday evening arrived with a suffocating heavy humidity that clung to the air like a damp shroud. Leo and I sat in our idling car parked just outside the towering wrought iron gates of my parents' Connecticut estate. The FBI had made a tactical adjustment to their operational timeline. Agent Thorne had contacted me late Thursday night with a critical update. The cartel receivers had pushed their offshore wire transfer deadline to exactly 8 o'clock on Friday evening. Thorne made the strategic decision to let the digital transaction initiate, allowing the Bureau to trace the receiving offshore accounts and map the entire global network before breaching the firm's headquarters. This delay granted me a surreal, agonizing window of time. My family believed they were executing their flawless masterstroke. They had no idea they were sitting on a federal landmine with a ticking timer. Leo shifted the car into drive, the tires crunching over the immaculate gravel as we proceeded up the winding tree-lined driveway. The sprawling lawns stretched out perfectly under the fading twilight, bathed in the soft glow of expensive landscape lighting. The circular driveway was already choked with an armada of high-end luxury vehicles. Mercedes, BMWs, and Range Rovers belonging to our extended family were parked shoulder to shoulder. My parents had called in the entire clan. We walked up the wide stone steps toward the heavy oak front doors. I did not bother knocking. I pushed the doors open and stepped directly into the lion's den. The sheer volume of the gathering hit me instantly, a wall of sound and heat. The grand foyer and the sprawling formal living room were packed to capacity with aunts, uncles, and cousins. They stood in clustered groups holding crystal champagne flutes and conversing in hushed, dramatic tones. The moment Leo and I crossed the threshold, the conversations died. The silence that fell over the house was immediate, absolute, and profoundly oppressive. They had all been summoned here to act as an intimidating audience, a physical wall of social pressure designed to force my total compliance. They had consumed Thomas and Barbara's lies completely. To them, I was the mentally unstable monster who had attempted to murder her own flesh and blood. Aunt Martha stood near the towering stone fireplace, clutching her pearls and looking at me with a mixture of profound pity and terrified disgust. Cousin Greg took a deliberate step backward, physically shielding his pregnant wife, as if I might suddenly lunge at them with a weapon. I kept my spine perfectly straight, refusing to acknowledge their judgmental stares, and walked deliberately toward the formal dining room. Leo stayed glued to my right side, his presence a solid, unyielding fortress of support against the crushing wave of condemnation radiating from the room. The dining room itself was a showcase of extravagant, suffocating wealth. The massive mahogany table had been extended to its maximum length, set for 20 guests with fine china crystal goblets and antique sterling silver cutlery. Towering floral centerpieces obscured the sightlines across the wood. Seated squarely at the head of the table was Cameron. He did not look like a man who had narrowly survived a lethal poisoning just days prior. He looked immaculate. His custom-tailored navy suit fit his broad shoulders perfectly, his hair was flawlessly swept back, and his color was excellent. He leaned back in his high-backed leather chair holding court with a smug, radiant arrogance. When he saw me enter the room, his lips curled into a sharp, malicious smirk. He picked up his water glass and offered me a mocking, silent toast. Everyone took their designated seats, the heavy wooden chairs scraping against the floorboards. I was placed directly across from Thomas, with Barbara seated immediately to his right. The seating arrangement was a tactical execution of psychological power, positioning me as the isolated target surrounded by hostile forces. I set my black leather purse squarely on the table next to my plate, angling it precisely toward the head of the table. Before the catering staff could even emerge from the swinging kitchen doors to serve the first course, Barbara stood up. She smoothed the front of her silk designer dress and picked up a silver spoon. She tapped it sharply against the rim of her crystal wineglass. The bright ringing sound echoed through the cavernous room, demanding absolute silence. The extended family immediately turned their attention to the matriarch. Barbara adjusted her posture, adopting the sorrowful, heavily burdened expression of a long-suffering martyr. She looked around the long table, making sure every single relative was watching her display of maternal grace. "Family is our greatest blessing," Barbara began, her voice quivering with an expertly manufactured tremor of emotion. "But as we all know, it can also be our heaviest trial. The events of this past week have tested the very fabric of our bond. We have faced darkness, betrayal, and a tragedy that almost cost us our beloved Cameron." She paused, letting the heavy silence amplify her words. Aunt Martha let out a loud, theatrical sniffle into a linen handkerchief. "But we are a family of faith and deep mercy," Barbara continued, turning her gaze directly onto me. Her eyes were flat, cold, and completely devoid of the warmth her words suggested. "We believe in second chances for troubled women. We know that mental illness is a terrible, destructive disease. Fiona, your psychotic break at your wedding reception was a desperate cry for help. You allowed your jealousy and your delusions to drive you to an unspeakable act of violence against your own brother." A low murmur of agreement rippled through the aunts and uncles. They looked at me with varying degrees of condemnation, fully expecting me to break down, confess my sins, and beg for the mercy Barbara was so generously extending. "We are willing to forgive you, Fiona," Barbara said, placing a hand dramatically over her heart. "We are willing to bury the police reports and keep your terrifying actions strictly private. We are willing to get you the intensive psychiatric help you so clearly need, but you must accept the guidance we are offering. You must surrender to the family." Barbara sat down to a gentle smattering of applause from the extended relatives. The stage was perfectly set. The audience was primed. It was time for the executioner to step forward. Thomas stood up slowly, adjusting his cuffs. He did not bother with the emotional theatrics his wife had employed. He operated entirely on raw, unadulterated power. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit coat and pulled out a thick stack of legal documents. The heavy parchment paper landed on the polished mahogany with a solid thud. Thomas placed his hand flat on top of the documents and slid them forcefully down the length of the long table. They glided over the polished wood, coming to a stop precisely in front of my empty dinner plate. He reached into his pocket a second time, retrieved a heavy gold-plated fountain pen, and tossed it onto the table. It clattered against the wood, rolling until it rested against the legal files. I looked down at the papers. The bold black text at the top of the first page was unmistakable. It was an irrevocable equity transfer agreement. It explicitly signed over my entire 50% stake in Grandfather Theodore's trust, granting Cameron total unrestricted access to the capital. "Sign it!" Fiona Thomas demanded, his voice ringing out with absolute dictatorial authority. "Apologize to your brother, hand over control of the trust right now, and we can remain a family. We will tear up the police report and let you walk out of here." Thomas reached into his jacket pocket one final time, extracting a secondary single sheet of paper. He held it up high for the entire room to see. "If you refuse," Thomas continued, pointing a finger directly at my face, "I have a psychiatric hold form right here. If you do not sign over the trust, we have 2 doctors on our payroll ready to sign off on your involuntary commitment tonight. You will be placed in a locked facility. You will lose your job, your husband, and your freedom. The choice is yours." Leo instantly shot up his heavy dining chair, scraping violently backward across the hardwood floor. His hands curled into tight, white-knuckled fists. His entire body radiated an explosive, protective rage. He looked ready to vault directly over the mahogany table and physically tear Thomas apart. The aunts and uncles gasped, shrinking back in their chairs. I reached up and placed a calm, steady hand on Leo's arm. I applied a firm, grounding pressure, silently telling him to hold the line. He breathed heavily through his nose, a muscle jumping in his jaw, but he slowly lowered himself back into his seat. I did not flinch. I did not cry. I did not yell. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting neatly in my lap. My silence hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. The extended family interpreted my lack of response and Leo's forced restraint as total submission. They thought I was paralyzed by fear. They thought I had finally been broken by the overwhelming weight of their collective judgment and the terrifying threat of institutionalization. Cameron let out a loud, patronizing laugh. He leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, feeling the absolute rush of absolute victory. He believed he had won. He believed his extortion plot was flawless, and that he was utterly untouchable in this room, shielded by the impenetrable armor of our parents' wealth and influence. "It is just business, sis," Cameron said, his voice dripping with malicious condescension. He looked at the extended family, playing directly to his audience. "You clearly aren't stable enough to manage your own assets. Let the men handle it. It is better for everyone this way." He was so drunk on his own perceived power that he could not resist twisting the knife. He needed to prove his dominance. He needed to brag. "Honestly, I am doing you a favor," Cameron continued, grinning broadly. "You would have blown that trust money on something stupid anyway. I know how to leverage capital. I took the capital because I needed it, and because I knew I could take it without you ever noticing. You were always too blind to see I was draining those accounts right out from under you." The dining room went dead silent at the brazen admission of theft, but no one dared speak against him. Cameron smiled maliciously, completely unaware of the black leather purse sitting on the table just inches from my hand. He did not know that nestled inside a digital audio recorder was actively running, capturing every single word of his confession in high-definition audio. I pointed the small black remote directly past Thomas's furious red face and aimed it at the massive 75-inch OLED smart television mounted above the stone fireplace in the adjoining living room. The open floor plan of my parents' estate ensured that every single person seated at the long mahogany dining table had a perfect, unobstructed view. I pressed the central button. The screen instantly flashed to life, illuminating the dim, tense space with a bright, harsh glow. The first piece of media was not a financial ledger or a complicated spreadsheet. It was the raw, unedited, uncompressed security footage Vance had pulled directly from the country club's master server. It played in flawless 4K resolution. I watched the extended family physically turn in their heavy wooden chairs. I watched their eyes lock onto the screen. The high-definition camera displayed the private hallway outside the bridal suite. It showed the catering tray. It showed the 2 crystal champagne flutes. And then it showed Cameron. A collective sharp intake of breath echoed down the length of the dining table as the digital version of my brother walked into the frame. The clarity of the lens captured the arrogant strut, the precise adjustment of his tuxedo cuffs, the careful, calculated way he looked over his left shoulder, then his right, ensuring the hallway was entirely deserted. No one spoke. The silence in the room was so absolute, so suffocating, that the only sound was the faint, rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning. On the screen, Cameron reached into his interior jacket pocket. He pulled out the small glass vial. We all watched as he popped the cork with his thumb. We watched him deliberately, carefully tilt the vial over the champagne flute on the left side of the silver tray. We watched the fine dusting of white powder cascade downward, instantly dissolving into the bubbling liquid. Aunt Martha let out a strangled, horrified gasp, her hand flying to her throat. Cousin Greg instinctively reached out and pulled his pregnant wife closer to his side, his face a mask of profound revulsion. The video continued to play mercilessly. It showed me stepping out of the bridal suite a few seconds later. It captured Cameron turning his back to greet a passing bridesmaid, flashing that signature charismatic smile that had fooled everyone in this room for 3 decades. And in that brief 5-second window, the camera caught my hand reaching out. It captured the seamless, flawless swap. The poisoned flute moved to the right. The clean flute moved to the left. I hit the pause button. The screen froze on a crystal-clear, undeniably damning image of Cameron happily picking up the poisoned glass, completely unaware that he had just sealed his own fate. I slowly lowered the remote and turned my gaze back to the head of the table. Cameron's smug, radiant arrogance had vanished entirely. The color drained from his face with such violent speed that his skin took on a sickly gray pallor. His jaw hung slack. His eyes were wide, darting erratically from the frozen image on the television screen to the horrified faces of his aunts and uncles, and finally to me. "That is a lie," Cameron stammered, his voice cracking a high, desperate sound that completely shattered his carefully constructed facade of dominance. He gripped the edge of the mahogany table, his knuckles turning white. "That is a fabrication. It is a deep fake. She paid someone to make that. Anyone can generate AI video these days. Look at the shadows. It is fake. She is trying to frame me. She." He looked frantically toward our parents, pleading for the blind, unconditional defense they had always provided. "Tell them it is fake, Dad. Tell them she is crazy. You know she is insane." Thomas did not speak. He was staring at the television screen, his mouth clamped shut in a tight, grim line. Even his boundless capacity for denial could not overwrite the absolute pixel-perfect reality playing out in front of him. I did not raise my voice to argue with Cameron's pathetic, flailing excuses. I simply pressed the right arrow on the remote control. Click. The video vanished. In its place, a massive, highly detailed financial dossier filled the screen. This was the financial nuke. I had spent hours optimizing the layout for maximum devastating clarity. On the left side of the screen were high-resolution copies of the official Cayman Islands banking statements. The corporate seal of the offshore shell company was blown up in the top corner. Below it, the ledgers showed the massive initial deposit of $500,000, matching the exact amount and date of Grandfather Theodore's trust disbursement. Next to it was a cascading, brutal list of withdrawals, all routed directly to high-risk, volatile cryptocurrency exchanges. The final balance at the bottom of the statement read exactly 0. On the right side of the screen, I had positioned the decrypted text messages retrieved from Cameron's burner phone. I had blown the font up so large that even my elderly uncle sitting at the far end of the table could read the violent, terrifying threats without his reading glasses. "Where is the cash, Davis? You owe us $800,000 by Friday noon. We know where your parents live. We know where your sister lives. You pay the principal and the interest, or we start breaking bones. Do not test us." The dining room erupted into a chaotic, panicked murmur. The older relatives leaned forward, squinting at the screen, reading the threats from the cartel loan shark. The reality of the danger Cameron had brought to their very doorstep was finally setting in. This was not a family dispute over inheritance. This was organized, violent crime. I placed the remote down on the table and looked directly at my brother. My voice was cold, precise, and cut through the rising panic in the room like a surgical scalpel. "You did not just try to drug me, Cameron. I stated, ensuring every single syllable carried absolute weight. You stole the entire $500,000 trust left to us by Grandfather Theodore. You set up a shell company in the Caymans, forged my signature to make me the managing director, and used my social security number to insulate yourself from the federal tax liability. Cameron tried to speak, his mouth opening, but no sound came out. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of evidence arrayed against him. You took our family's money. I continued my gaze, locking him in place, and you lost every single penny of it on a fabricated, leveraged crypto scheme. When you realized the money was gone, you got in bed with a cartel loan shark to try and win it back. You dug yourself into an $800,000 hole, and when they threatened to kill you, you decided the easiest way out was to slip a heavy narcotic into my champagne at my wedding reception. You tried to incapacitate me, trigger a fraudulent medical directive, and institutionalize me in a psychiatric ward so you could steal the rest of my assets to cover your tracks. The silence that followed my declaration was absolute. The aunts and uncles stared at Cameron, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disgust. The golden boy, the flawless heir to the Davis legacy, was completely exposed. He was a thief, an extortionist, and a man willing to sacrifice his own sister to save his own skin. I waited for the realization to fully crush him. I waited for Thomas to finally condemn the monster he had created. Instead, the sound of a chair scraping violently against the floor broke the silence. Barbara stood up. Her face was flushed a deep, mottled red. Her hands were shaking, gripping the edge of the table so tightly her fingernails dug into the polished wood. She looked at the television screen, reading the terrifying threats from the loan shark, and then she looked at me. Her eyes were not filled with horror at what Cameron had done. Her eyes were filled with pure, unadulterated hatred for me, the daughter who had dared to pull back the curtain. "You stop this right now, Fiona!" Barbara shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceiling. She pointed a trembling finger at me, desperately interjecting to defend her precious son. "You turn that screen off this instant." I stared at her, completely unfazed by her hysterics. "I am simply showing the family the truth, Mom. The truth you have been trying to bury. It was a business mistake," Barbara yelled, her voice cracking as she desperately attempted to rewrite the narrative to minimize attempted murder into a simple accounting error. He needed that money for his business. It was a temporary loan. He was going to put it back once his investments paid off. "You are being entirely selfish, Fiona." Aunt Martha gasped loudly, finally finding her voice. "Barbara, he tried to poison her. He stole her identity." Barbara whirled around, glaring at her sister-in-law. "Keep your mouth shut, Martha. You do not understand the pressure Cameron is under. He is carrying the entire legacy of this family on his shoulders." She turned back to me, her chest heaving with exertion. "You have a good job, Fiona." Barbara spat, hurling the words at me like weapons. "You have a rich husband. You live in a beautiful house. You have everything you could possibly need. He is your brother. He was in trouble. He needed the help, and you are trying to destroy him over money you do not even need. You should have just signed the papers quietly and helped him fix this." I looked at my mother. I looked at the woman who had spent 30 years tearing me down, criticizing my choices, and constantly demanding that I shrink myself to make Cameron look taller. I looked at the woman who was actively, aggressively defending a man who had slipped a lethal dose of narcotics into my drink. I did not yell back. I did not cry. I did not let a single ounce of her toxic manipulation penetrate my calm. I slowly reached out and picked up the black remote control from the table. I looked her dead in the eyes, my expression utterly devoid of emotion. I let a slow, cold smile curve the edges of my lips. "I am glad you feel that way, Mom," I said, my voice eerily quiet, commanding the attention of the entire room. "I am really glad you think Cameron's business debts are a family responsibility that requires absolute sacrifice." I raised the remote. Because of the next slide. The heavy oak front doors did not just swing open. They were forcefully breached. A wave of dark tactical gear and bright yellow FBI windbreakers flooded into the grand foyer, their heavy boots trampling over the imported Persian rugs. Local police officers flanked the federal agents, their presence entirely secondary to the massive federal raid now executing within the pristine walls of the Davis estate. The blinding red and blue strobe lights from the armada of cruisers parked outside pulsed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the terrified faces of the extended family in alternating flashes of crimson and ice. Aunt Martha dropped her crystal wine glass. It shattered against the hardwood floor with a sharp crash, the expensive red vintage pooling like blood around her designer shoes. She did not even flinch. She simply pressed herself flat against the dining room wall, her eyes wide with unadulterated horror. Uncle Greg grabbed his pregnant wife and pulled her behind the safety of a heavy velvet armchair, wanting absolutely no part of the fallout about to consume the room. The intimidating audience Thomas had so carefully assembled to force my compliance was now a captive audience to his ultimate destruction. Special Agent Marcus Thorne strode into the dining room, his posture radiating absolute unyielding authority. He did not look at the extravagant floral centerpieces or the terrified relatives cowering against the expensive wallpaper. His gaze locked instantly onto the head of the table. Cameron froze. The blustering, arrogant man who had just bragged about draining my inheritance and fleeing the country was suddenly reduced to a trembling, panicked child. He looked from Agent Thorne to the local officers, his chest heaving, as the reality of his situation violently collided with his delusions of untouchability. Cameron Davis. Agent Thorne announced, his deep voice slicing through the chaotic murmurs of the room. You are under arrest. Two federal agents flanked Cameron, immediately gripping his custom-tailored suit jacket and hauling him forcefully to his feet. Cameron thrashed against their grip, his expensive leather chair tipping backward and crashing to the floor. "Get your hands off me!" Cameron shrieked, his voice cracking into a high, desperate pitch. You have no jurisdiction here. My father is Thomas Davis. You cannot do this. I am leaving the country. Let me go. You are not going anywhere except federal holding, Thorne replied coldly, producing a thick set of metal handcuffs. You are being charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, international money laundering, corporate embezzlement, and the attempted assault of your sister using a controlled substance. You have the right to remain silent. I highly suggest you exercise it immediately. The heavy steel cuffs ratcheted shut around Cameron's wrists with a harsh metallic click that echoed through the entire dining room. The sound was definitive. It was the sound of the golden child's reign coming to a permanent catastrophic end. Cameron began to hyperventilate. The sweat beaded on his forehead, ruining his perfectly styled hair. He twisted his neck, looking desperately toward the head of the table. Mom. Dad, do something. Cameron pleaded, his voice breaking into a pathetic sob. Call the lawyers. Call the fixers. Tell them to post bail. You have to fix this. You cannot let them take me. Tell them she set me up. Tell them Fiona is lying. He looked at Thomas and Barbara, fully expecting the blind, unconditional protection they had provided for his entire 32 years of life. He expected the blank check. He expected the aggressive defense. But Thomas and Barbara were completely paralyzed. Thomas was staring blankly at the ruined equity transfer documents sitting on the table, the blue ink from my snapped fountain pen slowly bleeding into the heavy parchment. His face was entirely drained of blood, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. He was calculating the numbers. He was finally processing the final slide of my presentation, the second mortgage, the forged signatures, the $800,000 deficit, the impending foreclosure. Thomas realized in that exact moment that there were no lawyers left to call. There were no fixers to bribe. There was no money to post a federal bail bond. The lavish home they were standing in, the very symbol of their manufactured superiority, effectively belonged to the bank. Cameron had not just stolen my future. He had systematically dismantled their entire empire to cover his own gambling debts. The absolute terrifying reality of their financial devastation hit Thomas with the force of a freight train. He slumped backward into his chair, a hollow, broken man. Barbara physically collapsed. She gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning bone white as a ragged, breathless gasp tore from her throat. She looked at the federal agents dragging her precious, flawless son toward the front door. And then she looked at her husband, waiting for him to unleash his usual dictatorial power to stop it. When Thomas remained completely silent, simply staring at the spilled ink, Barbara finally understood the totality of their ruin. They were entirely penniless. They were being publicly humiliated in front of their most judgmental peers, and by Monday morning, they would be homeless. The front doors slammed shut behind Cameron and the federal agents, cutting off his frantic screams for help. The heavy silence that descended upon the dining room was thick and suffocating. The flashing police lights continued to pulse through the windows, a relentless reminder that the facade was permanently shattered. Barbara slowly turned her head toward me. The mask of the aggressive, condescending matriarch had completely melted away. In its place was a desperate, terrified woman staring into the abyss of her own consequences. The false superiority she had wielded against me for 3 decades was gone, replaced by a raw, pathetic need for survival. She stood up, her knees visibly trembling beneath her designer silk dress. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling over her mascara and tracking dark lines down her cheeks. It was not the theatrical performance she had staged earlier. This was genuine, unfiltered panic. "Fiona," Barbara whispered, her voice shaking violently. Her hands reached out across the table toward me, palms turned upward in a gesture of absolute pleading. "We did not know. We swear to you we had no idea about the second mortgage. We did not know he forged the signatures on the house." Thomas slowly lifted his head, his eyes hollow and desperate. He looked at me, no longer the commanding patriarch, but a man staring at his only remaining lifeline. "You have to help us," Thomas said, his voice a hoarse, unrecognizable croak. "You heard the agents. The bank is going to take the house on Monday. They are going to take everything. We have nothing left, Fiona. You have a successful business. You have Leo's income. You are the only one who can cover the deficit." Barbara nodded frantically, leaning further across the mahogany table. "Please, Fiona, we are your family. We are your parents. You cannot just leave us to be thrown out onto the street. You are our daughter. You owe us this. You have to save us." I sat perfectly still, listening to the echoing desperation in their voices. I looked at the two people who had spent 33 years treating my very existence as a profound inconvenience. I looked at the parents who had constantly compared me, belittled my achievements, and demanded that I shrink my own life to ensure Cameron always appeared larger. I looked at the people who had actively tried to institutionalize me in a locked psychiatric ward just 10 minutes ago to protect the man who had poisoned my drink. Now stripped of their wealth and their golden child, they were shamelessly demanding my resources. They were invoking the very family loyalty they had weaponized against me my entire life. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel the familiar crushing weight of daughterly guilt that used to govern my every decision. I felt absolutely nothing but cold crystalline clarity. I reached into my black leather purse one final time. My hand bypassed the hidden audio recorder and retrieved a single folded piece of thick white paper. I pulled it out and smoothed the creases against the edge of the table. It was the final invoice from the country club. It was the itemized bill for the emergency biological hazard cleanup required after the poisoned champagne had triggered a violent physical reaction on the center of their pristine ballroom floor. I looked directly into Barbara's weeping, desperate eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I dropped the invoice directly onto the table. It fluttered downward, landing squarely on top of the ruined equity transfer documents and the broken pieces of the gold fountain pen. The bold black numbers at the bottom of the page clearly displayed the $15,000 balance. "You backed the wrong horse," I said, my voice eerily calm and utterly final. "Good luck with the foreclosure." I stood up, pushing my heavy dining chair back. Leo immediately stepped in close behind me, his hand resting firmly on the small of my back. He did not say a word to Thomas or Barbara. He simply shot them a look of such absolute chilling disgust that Thomas physically recoiled in his seat. I picked up my purse, turned my back on the head of the table, and began walking toward the foyer. The extended family, the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had gathered to witness my surrender, parted like the Red Sea. They pressed themselves against the walls and the furniture, pulling their coats tight, making sure they did not even accidentally brush against my shoulders as I passed. They lowered their eyes, terrified of drawing my attention. I walked straight through them without offering a single glance or a word of goodbye. Leo pushed open the heavy front doors, and we stepped out onto the wide stone porch. The cool, crisp night air hit my face instantly, clearing the stifling, toxic atmosphere of the house from my lungs. The driveway was chaotic, swarming with remaining local police officers securing the perimeter, but the primary federal vehicles had already departed with Cameron in custody. We walked down the steps and across the gravel toward our car. The silence between Leo and me was comfortable and profound. It was the silence of a war permanently concluded. Leo unlocked the car, and I slid into the passenger seat, pulling the door shut behind me. The heavy thud of the car door closing felt like the final period at the end of a long, exhausting sentence. I leaned my head back against the headrest, letting out a long, slow breath. As Leo started the engine and shifted the car into drive, my phone buzzed sharply inside my purse. I pulled it out, the screen illuminating the dark cabin. It was an encrypted email notification routed through the secure federal server Agent Thorne had provided me. I opened the message, scanning the official Department of Justice letterhead. The text was brief, clinical, and absolutely beautiful. It was the formal confirmation from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. My sworn whistleblower immunity agreement had been fully executed and finalized by the federal prosecutor. I was permanently shielded from any collateral liability regarding Cameron's shell corporations. But the second paragraph was what truly mattered. The offshore accounts managed by the cartel receivers had been successfully breached and frozen by federal cyber units precisely at the 8 o'clock transfer deadline. The stolen $500,000 from grandfather Theodore's trust, along with the heavily leveraged cartel funds Cameron had attempted to wire, were currently locked in a secure federal holding account. The email confirmed that the necessary routing protocols had been initiated to transfer my legitimate stolen inheritance directly back into my personal private banking accounts by Monday morning. I locked the phone screen, a genuine, unrestrained smile breaking across my face as we rolled out of the iron gates and onto the open highway, leaving the flashing lights and the chaotic ruins of my family entirely behind me. 6 months passed. The transition from the suffocating chaos of that Friday night to the cold, undeniable reality of the present was absolute. The justice system, often slow and bureaucratic, moved with terrifying efficiency when handed a perfectly wrapped, impeccably documented package of federal offenses. Cameron's downfall was not a quiet, dignified retreat. It was a spectacular, highly publicized implosion that made the front page of every financial newspaper on the East Coast. I did not attend his sentencing hearing, but I read the court transcripts with a deep, profound sense of closure. The golden child, the untouchable heir to the Davis legacy, stood before a federal judge and was stripped of every defense he had ever known. The high-priced defense attorney Thomas desperately tried to put on retainer, demanded a massive cash retainer, upfront a retainer Thomas simply did not have. Cameron was forced to rely on an overworked public defender who took one look at the cartel wire transfers, the forged trust documents, and the high-definition security footage of the poisoned champagne and immediately advised his client to accept a plea deal. Cameron traded his custom-tailored $1,000 Navy suits for a standard-issue scratchy orange prison jumpsuit. The man who had mocked my financial acumen and claimed he was a master of capital leverage was sentenced to exactly 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The judge showed zero leniency, specifically citing the malicious, premeditated nature of the attempted assault with a controlled substance to cover up the embezzlement. There would be no early parole. There would be no luxurious halfway house. For the next decade, Cameron would live in a concrete cell, his days dictated by harsh fluorescent lights and armed guards. His desperate, frantic pleas for our parents to somehow bail him out, to pull a magical string or leverage a political favor, fell on completely deaf ears. They could not save him because they could not even save themselves. The foreclosure on my parents' sprawling Connecticut estate was executed with brutal, unapologetic speed. The bank, terrified of the cartel associations and the massive fraudulent second mortgage Cameron had secured, using forged signatures, moved to liquidate the property immediately. Thomas and Barbara were given 30 days to vacate the premises. The reality of their situation hit them not with a sudden crash, but with a slow, agonizing grind of daily humiliations. I received detailed updates from Aunt Martha, who called me in tears not out of sympathy for my parents, but out of sheer mortified embarrassment over the family name being dragged through the mud. She described the scene of their departure vividly. There were no professional moving companies with white glove service. There were no interior designers carefully wrapping their priceless antiques. Thomas and Barbara had zero liquid capital. They were forced to rent a battered, rusted U-Haul truck and pack their belongings themselves. Bank officials in crisp suits stood in the foyer with heavy clipboards meticulously inventorying every single chandelier, every piece of custom artwork, and every stick of expensive furniture that legally belonged to the estate to satisfy the debt. My parents were only allowed to take their personal clothing and a few boxes of basic necessities. Thomas, a man who had spent his entire life commanding boardrooms and dictating terms, was reduced to sweating through a cheap polo shirt as he struggled to drag cardboard boxes down the sweeping front steps. Barbara, stripped of her designer gowns and expensive jewelry, wept openly in the driveway. The social death was even more devastating to them than the financial ruin. The very people they had tried to impress, the elite social circle they had cultivated for 3 decades, turned their backs instantly. Their memberships to the exclusive country club were permanently revoked due to unpaid dues and the highly publicized criminal scandal. When Barbara attempted to attend her weekly charity luncheon, she was quietly but firmly asked to leave the premises by the event coordinator. They were radioactive. They had gambled everything on the illusion of Cameron's perfection, and when that illusion shattered, it took their entire world down with it. They moved into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, utterly isolated, penniless, and forced to live with the crushing weight of the choices they had made. While their world burned to the ground, mine expanded into something beautiful and brilliantly clear. The federal investigation into Cameron's offshore accounts acted as the ultimate vindication of my professional and personal integrity. The FBI not only utilized my forensic accounting reports to dismantle the cartel's domestic money laundering network, but they also formally commended my firm for the meticulous, bulletproof nature of the evidence provided. The high-profile nature of the case, combined with my absolute exoneration, catapulted my career into an entirely new stratosphere. I moved my forensic accounting practice out of the modest shared building and signed the lease on a massive, sleek office space in the heart of the financial district. The new firm featured floor-to-ceiling glass walls, polished concrete floors, and a growing team of brilliant, dedicated analysts. We were no longer just a boutique agency. We were the premier firm that high-level corporate clients called when they needed absolute, uncompromising truth. Corporations facing internal embezzlement or hostile takeovers wanted the accountant who had outsmarted a federal fraud ring and a cartel syndicate without breaking a sweat. My client roster tripled in the span of 3 months. The financial security I had fought so hard to protect was fully restored. The federal cyber unit successfully repatriated the entire $500,000 balance of Grandfather Theodore's trust. I watched the numbers populate on my encrypted banking portal, a solid, undeniable testament to my survival. I immediately invested the capital into a diversified, low-risk portfolio, securing a foundation of generational wealth that Cameron could never touch again. I had cleared my name, recovered my inheritance, and established a professional reputation that commanded immense, unwavering respect. But the true victory was not measured in square footage, client rosters, or bank balances. The true victory was the profound, unshakable peace that settled over my daily life. Friday evening arrived, bringing with it a warm, gentle breeze that carried the scent of blooming jasmine. Leo and I stood on the expansive wooden balcony of our new home. The house was a stunning mid-century modern build, nestled high in the hills, offering a panoramic, breathtaking view of the city skyline below. The sun was just beginning to set, painting the horizon in vibrant shades of crushed gold, deep violet, and soft crimson. The sprawling metropolis hummed with distant muted life, but up here above the chaos, everything was perfectly still. Leo stepped up behind me, wrapping his arms securely around my waist and pulling my back flush against his chest. I leaned into his solid, comforting warmth, resting my head against his shoulder. He pressed a soft, lingering kiss to the side of my neck. In his right hand, he held two slender crystal flutes. He passed one to me. I took the glass, feeling the cool, delicate crystal against my fingertips. The champagne inside was pristine, effervescent, and utterly untainted. The golden bubbles rose in a joyful, chaotic rush toward the surface, catching the fading light of the sunset. We did not need a grand, sweeping speech. We did not need an audience of judgmental relatives to validate our happiness. We only needed each other and the absolute certainty that we had weathered the darkest storm imaginable and emerged stronger, sharper, and completely free. Leo raised his glass, tapping it gently against the rim of mine. The soft melodic chime rang out clearly in the quiet evening air, a sound of pure celebration. To freedom, Leo murmured, his voice rumbling against my back, filled with a deep, resonating love. To freedom, I agreed. I lifted the crystal flute to my lips and took a long, slow sip. The champagne was crisp cold and tasted like absolute victory. I looked out over the sprawling city, feeling the steady, reassuring heartbeat of my husband behind me. The toxic, suffocating weight of my family's expectations, their constant manipulations, and their profound betrayals were entirely gone. They were a closed chapter, a cautionary tale I had successfully survived. I was no longer the scapegoat. I was no longer the target. I was the architect of my own life, defining success, security, and happiness purely on my own terms. And as the final rays of the sun dipped below the horizon, bathing our new home in a soft, peaceful twilight, I knew that the best years of my life were only just beginning. Fiona's journey from the family scapegoat to the architect of her own justice teaches us a profound and often painful truth about family dynamics. For decades, she was conditioned to believe that her worth was secondary, that her boundaries were inconveniences, and that loyalty meant suffering in silence. We are frequently taught from a young age that blood is thicker than water, that we must indefinitely forgive and accommodate the people who share our DNA, regardless of how they treat us. However, this story illustrates that toxic enablers will readily weaponize the concept of family to demand your sacrifice while completely excusing their own cruelty. Cameron Thomas and Barbara did not love Fiona. They loved the resources and the ego boost they could extract from her. When the very people who are supposed to protect you become the ones you desperately need protection from, walking away is never a betrayal. It is a necessary act of self-preservation. Furthermore, Fiona's triumph highlights that true power stems from independence and emotional clarity. She did not defeat her abusers by matching their hysteria or participating in their manipulative games. She won through meticulous preparation, financial literacy, and an unwavering commitment to the cold, hard facts. She built her own impenetrable safety net. When the ultimate crisis hit, she didn't wait for her abusers to grant her mercy. She relied on her chosen family and her own unshakable spine. Ultimately, the sweetest revenge isn't just watching toxic people face the natural consequences of their actions. It is stepping out of their destructive cycle entirely and defining success on your own terms. Have you ever had to draw a hard line with toxic relatives to protect your own peace and future? Share your experience in the comments below. If Fiona's journey of reclaiming her power resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience, justice, and finding your true worth. Remember, you alone hold the pen to the final chapter of your life.